Greetings, my fellow Westorians. I'm Aziz, with me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis. Valar Rereadis is a journey through the books for people who have made the journey before, brought to you by people who have made the journey many times. George R. Martin has said before, and will definitely say again, this series, A Song of Ice and Fire, was designed to be read and reread. We're your tour guides on this journey, but even we doing this full time can't catch everything. So if you're watching live, you can feel free to ask live questions or submit live comments. And you can also send questions and comments in advance, ahead of time, by joining us on one of our social media platforms. Facebook, Flick, Discord, Slack, and of course we're on Twitter and other places as well. And you can catch us on Patreon as well. Join us there to get benefits like early episode release. We just released part 2 of The Dance of the Dragons, so that's available now for patrons. We'll be up for public release later. And of course, lots of other benefits like access to scripts and cool shout outs from time to time. Also encourage you all to check out the Isle of Faces podcast, Joe Buckley's show, that is called Scraps and Scrolls when it's dealing with Valar Rereadis. It's a companion to ours. Also check out Good Queen Alley on Tumblr. That's Nina's blog, and a lot of her thoughts that make it into our show, a lot of these great things are also over there, and some ones that you would have missed as well. So check it out. It is Ashea and I's 8-year anniversary.
Woo!
Little personal news for y'all. Yeah, we just kind of realized that was today.
Yeah, yesterday. I was like, oh wait, 8 years.
How about that? Yeah. I guess we weren't exactly on top of that date as it approached.
No,
But
it's hard when it's the same month as Valentine's Day. It's hard to care as much.
Yeah, that's true. But now that it's here, we're like, yay. So this week for y'all, we've got Sansa 3, the one where Joff wants to be like Aegon the Unworthy, a.k.a. surprise, you're married.
Arya 5, Storytime, Battle of the Bells, a.k.a. the gang captures the Hound.
Jon 4, the gang climbs the wall, a.k.a. the one where Val becomes single.
Jaime 4, the one with Thappireth, a.k.a. Qyburn Stump Thappireth.
And the one with Ice Reforged, a.k.a. the gang makes singers stew. There's a decent bit of action in these chapters. Not the major epic kind, of course. That's more for later in the book. But this is set up for exactly that, for aforementioned epic major action. In Arya's chapter, she sees the Hound's face, but the reader is only told that it was someone she'd prayed it would be. That's going to set up his incredible duel with Lord Beric, and all that follows from there, and that, of course, sets up Arya's long stretch of 8 chapters where the Hound is particularly prominent in her chapters. Jon's chapter just ends, sort of, with Ygritte talking of opening graves and loosing shades into the world and not finding the Horn of Joramun. This, of course, sets up the great conflict Jon faces on the other side of the wall with regard to innocence, then defending Castle Black across several chapters featuring various assaults, and, of course, the death of Ygritte. The marriage of Tyrion and Sansa is not about any sort of lasting union between them, but about power dynamics, the Purple Wedding, Sansa's long arc in the Vale, and how both of these characters and the ones around them react to this development. Super chat from Maura Lee for Aziz and Ashea, just a show of love and support to you both for all the excellent content. Well, thank you, Maura. We appreciate it. Sansa 3, the one where Joff wants to be like Aegon the Unworthy, a.k.a. surprise, you're married. The first line is...
On the morning her new gown was to be ready, the serving girls filled Sansa's tub with steaming hot water and scrubbed her head to toe until she glowed pink.
The kind of thing you can't really notice unless you really look ahead. This is chapter 29. Sansa won't have another chapter until number 60. So more chapters than we've covered so far have to pass before we get back to her again. Of course, she'll appear in other chapters, but before we get a POV from her, it'll be a little while. But then she's going to have chapter 62, so almost back to back. And this is the Purple Wedding and her fleeing for the Vale. So that's going to be pretty big. And of course, like I said, this is what we're setting up with this chapter. Among other things, she's going to learn that anyone can pass information and spill secrets. It's in this chapter that she thinks that Dantos doesn't count. when wondering who could have spilled the secret about her marriage to Willis. She just passes over him and considers that it had to be one of the other people, because it clearly couldn't be, well, the guy that it actually was. And this is a bit of a recurring theme for Sansa, something that I imagine she'll tighten up when she gets a little older. And of course, what I mean is little slips of information. Some of them her own, not all of them are hers. Some of them she maybe just happened near her. But these little slips of information have had a huge impact on her outlook since early on. Of course, the biggest one, or rather the first one, being accidentally telling Cersei about her father's plans. George uses tricks to give the reader the idea that maybe Sansa could get used to Tyrion, and perhaps even love him, by doing little things like comparing his appearance to the Hound, which eventually she, isn't too bothered by his look. So maybe the reader can be fooled into thinking that she'll get used to Tyrion also. And then we have little things like Garland Tyrell, who seems like a decent guy, pointing out to Sansa that Tyrion will be a better husband than Loras would have. Which, there's some hidden meaning in that, because Sansa doesn't know about Loras's orientation. Garland probably does, but maybe even he doesn't. And Garland says he is a bigger man than he seems, I think. So this is all set up to trick us, right? Since the marriage was never consummated, it's unlikely to have a major impact on their future arc in terms of the legality of it, the marriage itself. Certainly the feelings they experience during it are very important, and that's lasting. But the marriage itself as an institution, that probably isn't going to make much difference down the line. This mini arc is more about, like I said, how everyone reacts to it. It's part of Sansa's education and growth, and as part of Tyrion's growth in a different direction and his eventual fracture from his family. As we say in the title, Joffrey is a bit like, and cites even more, Aegon IV. And this is kind of funny to me in a not funny, not ha-ha funny way. Joffrey, who is dull and not at all interested in history, well, he found this king interesting. He's like, ooh, Aegon the Unworthy, this guy, I like this one. Obviously, Joffrey would like Aegon the Unworthy, arguably the worst of all the Targaryen kings. And ironic, too, that of all the kings that Joffrey's non-father, Robert, actually most emulates, it's Aegon the Unworthy. They have a lot in common, especially the bit about fathering countless bastards. On the other hand, as irresponsible and womanizing as Robert could be, he didn't enjoy cruelty, nor did he openly claim married women like Aegon the Unworthy did. But to Joffrey, this all sounds great. He's like, yeah, I want to do that. Hence how he fondles Sansa in this scene. Not nearly the first time this has happened to her since she's come to King's Landing, and she's still not even 13. Tyrion putting a stop to the bedding ceremony is surely a relief, though it creeps right back in when they're alone, and he seems intent on, quote, doing their duty, as he puts it. He is disgusted, she is terrified and disgusted, but it's a different kind of disgust that they're both feeling. So there's more relief when he says he can't do it. This is a contentious point in the fandom. Some think Tyrion is a good person for his behavior here, and others would say he's almost as bad as the rest. That's really up to the reader. I think most moral judgments do fall that way. They're both forced into this and have limited agency, though he does have more agency than she does, for sure. He's interesting and funny and clever, and he's generally acting against terrible people throughout the series to this point. So Tyrion, we generally feel terrible for him when it comes to Tywin. And what would you do if you were Tyrion in a situation like this, where Tywin's your father and he's forcing you into this marriage? I don't know. We would also feel a deep uneasy guilt when thinking he should leave his own family, right? Because we can't disagree that his family and their level of power is the reason he wasn't left to die as an infant. So it's a very strange conundrum for him to consider that the reason he's alive is because of his family that treats him badly. What do you do with that? It's a challenge to consider, and it's sometimes it makes us sympathize with Tyrion, sometimes it makes us hate him more. Again, it's really up to the reader, but it's hard to say something other than he's very gray. I mean, I think if you're trying to sum it up, that works as a simplistic version. And I think it's a recurring pattern with Tyrion where George is slowly getting us to like him while not really making the case for him being a great person. There's been a long series of him not doing the wrong thing, which is different than doing the right thing. And I think this marriage is a perfect example of that concept. Tyrion's not a good guy for deciding to wait until his child bride accepts him. Forcing himself on Sansa would be a bad deed, but we don't give medals or even praise for not doing bad deeds. So if I'm Sansa, I'm relieved and I'm glad this isn't as bad as it could have been, but that's different than being thankful. She has no reason to be thankful. Thanks for not traumatizing me. Thanks for not endangering my life. I mean, and yeah, that's taking into account the setting. It is not normal for men to sleep with 12-year-olds, even in Westeros or medieval society. You know, if you've been told otherwise, check your sources. And even Tyrion and Tywin should know that this is too young for a pregnancy. So the moral and medical reasons are present even here in this time frame, even this setting.
You know,
they know these things.
A question here.
Sure.
If Tyrion had put his foot down, if he had
Yeah.
said no, what would Tywin have done? Who could he have even married Sansa to that would have locked up the North?
Damien. He's threatened to name him
Yeah.
to Daemon Lannister.
So would Daemon have been significantly worse?
We don't know.
We just don't know. See, so Tyrion, in terms of you talking about how gray this makes him,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
If he thinks someone will be a lot worse, then, well, take one for the team.
It's true, and she told, like if he knows he's going to, but he doesn't know what's worse for her. That's the other problem. Is like,
Yeah.
well, what would she rather marry Daemon?
Yeah, or a dwarf.
Yeah, so it is a huge conundrum, and I try to not to judge it too much because it's a really difficult spot. Like, I don't know what I would do. I don't know if I would do what I would do if I was Sansa. I don't know what I would do if I was Tyrion.
If you're Sansa, you don't have a lot of choices on what to do.
Well, I mean, you're right. I don't mean do. I mean, like, how would I behave? Like, what would I say? You know what I
Okay.
mean? Yeah, like, how would I manage this situation as best as possible, given that limited agency? Sansa's social training here is really something to behold. She's always dreamt of this moment, but not this moment. This is the opposite of that dream. She still does almost everything expected of her, though, other than being unable to pretend that she likes it, which is just too much to ask. I mean, it would be incredibly hard for anyone to pretend to enjoy any of this. Tyrion isn't able to pretend he enjoys it, and he's an adult. And she's 12 again. He's like 25. She tells herself it will be easier if she's drunk for it. A 12-year-old is saying, this will be easier if I'm drunk. And Sansa's not much of a drinker in the first place. She just kind of understands from seeing drunk people that people who are drunk are often stupid or silly and they lose inhibitions, and she's just... Hopefully that helps. She's confusing being inhibited with being disgusted. She's not really inhibited here. She's just grossed out and anxious and other stronger words. But she still goes through the motions. She still does what she thinks is expected of her. It's like this is soldiering on, in a different sense. And that's the heart of it. This is her duty, like Tyrion says. And he's right according to what they've been taught. But in another sense, it's, very much not their duty. It's their duty to not do it. Yet as clear as the expectations upon them are, so too is the clarity of this mutual discomfort. She doesn't want it. He doesn't want it. Ask around. Well, he kind of does. But you know what I mean. He's disgusted by it. He's very torn up about it. Ask around, really. Nobody wants it except Tywin, right? It's kind of stunning when you distill it like that. He's really the only person that wants this marriage. Not even Cersei wanted it. Not even Joffrey. And not that Joffrey's against it. He just doesn't care. He figures he can do whatever he wants anyway. The marriage is no real barrier to him. It's kind of irrelevant.
Real quick, I
Yeah.
did want to bring up, we were incorrect when we were talking about Damian Lannister. He's married.
What do you mean?
That Sansa was not offered, Tywin didn't give Damian as the alternative. He just asks her, would you prefer marrying the other Lannister?
I think he said, no, Tywin did. Tyrion didn't, but Tywin did.
No, I'm saying Tywin didn't, but it was Damian is married.
Damian wasn't married at this time, though. He's married now. He's married to a Frey. He got married to a Frey in a Feast for
Damian
Crows.
is married to Shiera Craycall.
Oh, I'm thinking of
And
not
they're-
Damian. I'm thinking of Daemon, not Damian.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sorry, not Damian. Damon, the one with the long hair who doesn't cut his hair because his father
Oh.
was killed by Rickard Karstark.
Okay.
Yeah, that's who I meant. That's who they were talking about doing. And then instead he marries
Other people are bringing
Frey.
up Lancel. Anyways.
Lancel was suggested also,
Yeah.
but that obviously didn't go happen. Yeah. Anyway, some super chats here. River Missoula 777 for luck. Thank you very much. And a few thoughts from Nina here. There's a uniquely modern horror to the reader at the beginning of this chapter in seeing Sansa put on a white gown, since white is the established color for Western wedding dresses in a very modern development. Some readers may have caught that and realized what was happening. And of course, this is being communicated when she's putting the dress on, even though Sansa doesn't know it. And it's kind of the opposite of the Arya scene where with the Hound, where everyone there in that scene knows that it's the Hound, including her, and the reader doesn't, whereas it's the opposite here, where pretty much everyone except Sansa knows what's happening. It's ironic that Sansa thinks Willis will, quote, forget Winterfell when he sees her in her dress, considering that the dress is explicitly designed to communicate that Sansa is the heiress of House Stark, and she's literally head to toe dressed in Stark colors, white and gray. Now, Cersei makes very clear that Sansa never had a choice whether to be married to Tyrion. Cersei made Sansa feel trapped by saying everything was already prepared, emphasized how alone and powerless she was as a ward of the crown, and tried to humiliate her by suggesting that resistance would make her a laughingstock, even though, well, that happened anyway. People were laughing because of because of Tyrion standing on a fool and all that. Sansa was literally caught, faced with the knowledge that she was going to be dragged into the marriage, despite her saying no, and threatened by the presence of her most frequent physical abuser, Meryn Trant. Not exactly left with many options. And there's another little bit of thing that's easy to miss about the clothing here. Cersei immediately, very early in the chapter, says, don't tear the gown, it's very expensive. And then Joffrey goes and rips it, in advance of the bedding ceremony that doesn't actually take place before Tyrion, because Tyrion shuts it down. There's some subtle and dark irony in Tommen saying he wants to be married. Well, just wait, Tommen. The Tyrells they got their eyes on you. So a point of comparison to a Sansa marriage is Dany, because they weren't that much different in age when forced into marriage, but the circumstances are very different. Dany has always been terrified of marriage because she knows that, well, she thought she was going to get married to her own brother, and then next thing she knows, it's going to be this warlord. Whereas Sansa has grown up dreaming of marriage, and of course, how their marriages proceed are very different as well, whereas Sansa's doesn't really last or even really get off the ground, and Drogo and Dany is quite formative for Dany. Lady Merryweather makes an appearance in this scene, and it's kind of hard just from this moment to realize that she's going to be pretty important later. And this is a character that I'm kind of surprised didn't get used on TV. You'd think that the show would be all about the hot ladies that have, girl-on-girl scenes.
I know. It's shocking to me that they did not have Taena.
I
mean, already, Arianne, that's a whole thing. But Taena's a pretty minor character. They could have easily squeezed her in.
Yeah, exactly. And she would have been very noticeable. Anyway.
We're like, Cersei's in a gay relationship?
Maybe Lena was like, nah, y'all, I'm not doing that.
Oh, God, I hope not.
They were like, come on, please.
She read the chapter. She was
she's like, yeah, that's not happening.
Mirror Swamp, no.
Mirror Swamp. Yeah, she's
Cersei and Taena actually, it becomes kind of sweet later, where they're like sitting in the tub together, having actually very close moments. We'll get to that later, but I don't know. There's a little more vulnerability between them than I remembered until I reread it a few times.
Word, yeah. Well, we'll be seeing more of her later.
I like Taena a lot, basically.
Yeah, we'll be getting lots of her in A Feast for Crows. So this is kind of her lead-in. And a couple other comments here. Stefan B. from Flick says that Sansa notices the difference in his eyes. Hunger in his green eye, fury in his black. And that does sound a bit like what's going on in the Dance of the Dragons. It's the greens have hungered for power, and the blacks are angry that it was taken from them. Kind of works, yeah. Definitely also shows that Tyrion is torn in the moment, because he is very conflicted, and it's a really interesting way for George to write it. Sansa's very observant. We talk a lot about how she's observant and very good at reading people, even though it's balanced with her age and missing some things because of her lack of experience. But this is a very poignant little bit of her of observation by her, and it extends into these other plot lines, which is fun. there's the line from the marriage, which is part of the wedding vows. Cursed be the one that comes between them. And well, the ones who come between Tyrion and Sansa's marriage would be Littlefinger and the Tyrells, I guess. And cursed be. It seems like Littlefinger's probably not going to end well. So there was a really good discussion on Flick where a lot of the regular contributors discussed how even Tywin doesn't seem to be a fan of the bedding ceremony here. Tywin prefers dignity. He's not a big, partying, raucous guy. You can see why he wasn't a fan of this, and he thinks a display of wealth is useful, but excessive behavior might remind him of his father, and of course, can you imagine Tywin being on the receiving end of this? Well, actually he was, and that's the heart of it, I think. Tywin hated the bedding ceremony. Aerys supposedly took liberties with Joanna during it, so he's going to have poor memories of the bedding ceremony, even discounting the fact that it's the kind of decorum it indicates is not something you would really think Tywin would be a fan of. But it's a personal thing for him. And, well, thinking about Aerys and Joanna, of course, raises the specter of Tyrion Targaryen, but if anything, there's counter evidence here. Much has been made of the line where Tyrion, or rather when Tywin says, "You are not my son." But there's so many examples of when he says, "You are my son." And there's one of them here. Tywin says, "My son is drunk," when he's trying to get Joffrey to back down from Tyrion's angry, violent comments about gelding Joffrey. Still, I had missed that. Any example of Tywin referring to Tyrion as his son is part of belongs on the ledger of evidence, I suppose, when we're discussing that. Okay, so big chapter, but we're going to get more of it from Tyrion's point of view, thinking about what this means and how Sansa's going to deal with it later as well. Well, let's move on. Arya 5, Storytime, Battle of the Bells, a.k.a. the gang captures the Hound. Facebook mod Scott suggested the name The One Where Gendry Nearly Sleeps with His Sister, and yeah, that is a good, apt name for this one. She's one of the Bells herself, Bella being her name, and the first line of the chapter is...
Stony Sept was the biggest town Arya had seen since King's Landing, and Harwin said her father had won a famous battle here.
Indeed, he did. Before Robert and Ned won that famous battle, he impregnated Bella's mother, and we get this hilarious line after Bella propositions Gendry.
The girl did have hair like the old kings, Arya thought. A great thick mop of it, as black as coal. That doesn't mean anything, though. Gendry has the same kind of hair, too. Lots of people have black hair.
Yeah, the seed is strong. And yeah, it is confirmed, by the way. This isn't just a strong piece of evidence that Bella is Robert's child. It's confirmed in the World of Ice and Fire app that she is definitely his kid. So, and of course we know for sure Gendry is. So this is really funny and very easy for a first-time reader to miss the significance, the humor, all that. Another example of a line written for a second or third or fourth time reader. Well, come on, Baratheon kids, though. You know that we said the seed is strong, but that Targaryen blood in your heritage comes from multiple sources, and while black hair is a genetic trait, a penchant for incest is not. So yeah, just stand down, y'all. Let's not go there. This is fitting given we just had Sansa 3 where Joff acts like Aegon the Unworthy, and all those bastards we talked about briefly, and here is one of them, or two of them, really. And yeah, there are all kinds of problems that come with being a king, or even a regular man who doesn't help raise his children. But this is one I didn't ever consider. If your kids don't know who their dad is, they might commit accidental incest. So raise your kids lest they accidentally bang. This danger is magnified when your kids get your genes and grow into hot adults, because that black hair and Gendry's a big dude. Sound like pretty good looking people, right? And Stony Sept here is in bad shape. It's functional.
Real quick, I do have to say, you're talking about sound like good looking people. Extra so because of course Robert's going to be sleeping with gorgeous women.
Yeah, he gets this pick of the
so
group. Yeah.
Genetics are also good on the other side.
And remember what Cersei thinks of Robert on their wedding day? Like he was a god.
Yes.
So yeah. So yeah, Stony Step's in pretty bad shape, but it functions. It needs repairs, but it's not completely destroyed or depopulated like other parts of the Riverlands. And this is in part because they're on the outskirts of the Riverlands. They're very close to the Reach, which wasn't burned at all, and of course is quite fertile. So they have some proximity to food sources in the close by region there. They can go over there and buy and sell and trade. But that's the problem when starvation is rampant. The people of Stony Sept having a small amount of food makes them a target for those who have none, or those who are evil, like the Brave Companions. And those guys are clearly around this area. The danger of broken men, outlaws, and ruthless sellswords is compounded by those hunting for Jaime Lannister to claim one of the many rewards offered for him. Way back in a Game of Thrones, it's the Karstark men who whisper within earshot about how they'd rather be dead than broken, as Bran appears to be. This is really ironic, brutally ironic, I would say, because Bran is going to go on to do great things while many of the Karstarks lose everything. It's like Mirri Maz Duur's lessons to Dany and about Khal Drogo. What is life worth when all else is gone? Like a genie granting a wish in a way you don't expect. Oh, you think losing your legs makes you broken? Let's see what you think of life when use of your legs is about the only thing you have left. These Karstark men have no honor, no decency. They live like rabid wild animals, and if any shred of their humanity remains, it's probably focused on how haunted they are by their own acts. Like they've done all these evil things, and any decent person who commits deeds like that is gonna feel bad about themselves. That's a broken man. This is worse than the depths the BWB are going to fall into later, which is important considering their presence here defending justice, the same justice that they won't be about later, at least a lot of them. So we've been hearing about these Karstark men on the rampage for a while, but now we actually see them close up in this particular very dark capacity. Splashing water and buzzing flies and torture. It's kind of like a mini Astapor, but the men being subjected to horror in this case are neither slaves nor innocent. They're these Karstark men. The descriptions of what they did are about as horrible as what's been done to them. So we see some real eye for an eye justice, which the Brotherhood Without Banners declares isn't justice at all. So they put them out of their misery. Consider this line then. This is coming later. Brienne 8 in A Feast for Crows.
Justice. Thoros smiled wanly. I remember justice. It had a pleasant taste. Justice was what we were about when Beric led us. Or so we told ourselves. We were kingsmen, knights, and heroes. But some nights are dark and full of terror, my lady. War makes monsters of us all.
And to be clear, he's saying knights are dark and full of terror, as in men in armor and knights with a K. Even Lord Beric is a bit of a monster in a different way, a thing that should not be, but a good thing, mostly. And they cite him in this chapter as the reason they were about justice. And in this Brienne chapter, they cite him as the reason they're not anymore, because he's gone. It was apparently him that really upheld that part of their beliefs. And without him, it starts to fade, especially because the person who takes over, Lady Stoneheart, is very much not about justice. She's about vengeance. Arya sees an example of giving mercy here, and will give some of her own later in future chapters, and will be called mercy even later. She says Valar Morghulis when Anguy finishes off this first prisoner. Here's a thought from Nina. There's a very straightforward piece of foreshadowing in this chapter for Arya's coming training with the Faceless Men. The Karstark men beg for mercy, and the gift of mercy is a euphemism for killing someone to end their pain. And think about how at the House of Black and White, they drink from the pool and then they die. And that's kind of what happens here. She gives the man a drink, and then he's given the gift of mercy. The Faceless Men also believe that it is not their position to decide who lives and who dies, only to carry out the will of him of many faces by killing those marked to die. The Karstark men had already been condemned by their conduct, so Anguy only puts them out of their suffering.
It's funny, too. The Faceless Men follow him of many faces, god of death.
Yeah.
They're following Beric, The dead man.
That's true. That's very true. There's a lot of
dead.
It's really interesting how Beric is both a stand-in for Bloodraven and a stand-in for the House of Black and White and Him of Many Faces. It's really neat how all these impressions, these crossover themes are brought forth here. And it is interesting too. The Faceless Men, they don't want revenge, as they try to wean that out of their followers or their disciples. You're not supposed to go kill people because you hate them, and that's why a big part of their thing is you don't kill people you know. You're supposed to. I know this man. I know that woman. So that excludes you from the job.
It's the opposite of Lady Stoneheart.
Very much. You're right. Very opposite. Very true. Wow, good catch. I've said before, it's a good time to remind everyone, though, that Anguy is one of the ones who does not stay with the Brotherhood after the turn. So this seems to be a setup for that. He's on the side of mercy and justice, and so when Stoneheart comes in and is the opposite of that, it makes sense that he would leave, along with some of the others like Edric. And that is just really well set up. All these very, not minor maybe, characters isn't the right way to put it, but less major characters have very compelling backstories that just add up. You look for the setup for the way these characters behave, and it's there. The detail, the nuance, I really love it. Now, the Hound, of course, comes here. Now, as rereaders, we know it's the Hound. Arya, it's not actually revealed, as I said before. It's not revealed completely till the next chapter. The clues are there. And later, the Hound is going to mock the Brotherhood without banners, which, to be fair, I mean, he mocks just about everyone. But if not for their presence here at Stony Sept, meaning the Brotherhood, the Mad Huntsman would have put Clegane in a crow cage like he did these Karstark men, and there wouldn't have been anyone to give him justice or mercy, most likely. And though Arya gives it to these men, she doesn't know here, she won't give the Hound mercy when he's dying later in this book. And of course, that kind of works out since he almost certainly survives because of that, but that's another story. Another wolf dream for her in this one. It's not a very specific one. It's just another day in the life of Nymeria, Wolf Queen of the Riverlands, I think, hunting and dominating her pack. Though it's interesting, I suppose we should mention that the thing she thinks of killing in this dream is a horse, not a deer or an elk. And maybe that's a subtle reminder that Nymeria and her pack are not keeping away from human activity. In fact, they seem drawn to it, which is unusual for wolves, but the unusualness of Nymeria's pack has been cited several times, so I suppose this is just keeping us in line with that. Let's see here. A couple catches from Joe. George waits just long enough for the pain and torture to sink in before pulling the carpet from under our feet by listing the despicable crimes that these men gave. What he means is that when we stumble on these characters stuck in the crow cages, we don't know the awful things they've done. We just see, oh my God, they're just men in cages. What is going on? Then we find out what they did. And it makes it really difficult for the reader, in the same sense that it's going to be difficult for Arya down the line when she's facing these concepts of the House of Black and White and learning about things like revenge and mercy. Is this right? Is torturing them justified? Is the evidence that what they did enough? I mean, it's word of mouth. It's complicated. And, well, here's a quote. She looked at their filthy hair and scraggly beards and reddened eyes, at their dry, cracked, bleeding lips. Wolves, she thought again, like me. Was this her pack? How could they be Robb's men? Joe suggests this is part of her disassociation from her identity, which, of course, is going to go run much deeper as she heads on this path towards the House of Black and White. And it's being harder and harder for her to identify with her family. She's been farther away from them. We've talked about things like how she's losing sense of even how old she is, things like that. And at first, it kind of looked like Arya was moving on from the question of identity for these men as Northmen, rather than taking on, or instead taking on the moral question of whether it's right to answer suffering with suffering, or whether justice is better served by being the better person. And, well, we do get a little Arya Stark here, though, because she's thinking of her identity, and then we get all this business about her father and the Battle of the Bells, which is something, and Harwin talking about his experience, which is something that maybe brings her back to it a little bit. So this chapter is wonderful in how it bounces back and forth between these extremes and shares these and shows what Arya is being faced with, as well as these other people. It's, of course, not just about Arya. I think there's Gendry and the Brotherhood and these townspeople. Here's another quote. Lem, is that you? Still wearing the same ratty cloak, are you? I know why you never wash it. I do. You're afraid all the piss will wash out and we'll see you're really a knight of the Kingsguard. Joe points out that how can this not be tinfoil hidden in plain sight? Like that kind of line, the way that's written, it almost sounds like George is hiding something or setting something up for later. But I honestly don't know what it would be. There's the Richard Lonmouth theory of Lemon Cloak doesn't include anything to do with the Kingsguard that I'm aware of. He was a friend of Robert. Maybe Robert had told him one day you could be in my Kingsguard. But I don't have any... There's nothing written about that I'm aware of. Maybe Lady Gwyn would know better. She's the one who knows this Lonmouth theory best, the Knight of Skulls and Kisses. But anyway, moving on from that, it's a small bit. Let's talk a bit about the Battle of the Bells itself. That's a really important piece of history here. Not only is it important here, but it becomes important later. It comes back full circle with another character later. Of course, that would be Jon Connington. In a meta sense, it seems like we've had a lot of these examples lately, meaning the perspective of Dany's epic play in Astapor followed up much later by Quentin's very different take from a very different angle on what happened at Astapor. Then we have that with Barristan, with being at Ned's execution, we find out much later, as well as some other things. Varamir Sixskins revisits Jon's meeting with Mance much later. Brienne and Jaime. Of course, Brienne thinks back on her times with Jaime the next book, and so we get different looks. Now, again, we get the same concept. Harwin tells us the Stark perspective on the Battle of the Bells, while 2 books from now, we're going to get a take from someone who saw things much differently. But this is different than any of these other examples even, because this is kind of like that concept mashed up with George's coverage of the Blackwater, where he gives you a lot of different perspectives on the same event. Takes from both sides of the action, in other words, from characters who have a different outlook as to the result and to why it matters. Here's the quote.
Last night he dreamt of Stony Sept again. Alone, with sword in hand, he ran from house to house, smashing down doors, racing upstairs, leaping from roof to roof, as his ears rang to the sound of distant bells. Deep bronze booms and silver chiming pounded through his skull, a maddening cacophony of noise that grew ever louder until it seemed as if his head would explode. 17 years had come and gone since the Battle of the Bells, yet the sound of the bells ringing still tied a knot in his guts. Others might claim that the realm was lost when Prince Rhaegar fell to Robert's warhammer on the Trident, but the Battle of the Trident would never have been fought if the Griffin had only slain the stag there in Stony Sept. The bells tolled for all of us that day, for Aerys and his queen, for Elia of Dorne and her little daughter, for every true man and honest woman in the 7 kingdoms, and for my silver prince. The road ahead was full of perils, he knew, but what of it? All men must die. All he asked was time. He had waited so long. Surely the gods would grant him a few more years, enough time to see the boy he'd called a son seated on the Iron Throne, to reclaim his lands, his name, his honor, to still the bells that rang so loudly in his dreams whenever he closed his eyes to sleep.
Starting off responding to that quote or analyzing that quote in the Battle of the Bells with some thoughts from Nina. For Harwin, the Battle of the Bells was a storied victory for the rebel cause, a moment of triumph for Robert and especially Ned. For Jon Connington, the Battle of the Bells was the worst moment of his life, the moment where he personally lost Robert's rebellion and doomed Rhaegar, and he blames himself for not being more violent, and specifically more Tywin-like in his dealing with Stony Sept. Miles Toyne, Blackheart, a former, Lord Commander of the, or Lord Captain of the, or Captain General, whatever the title is, for the leaders of the Golden Company, top guy of the Golden Company, had advised him that he should have burned the place down, reduced every building and person to ash, and so made sure Robert could never have been, never beaten him or continued the rebellion. Harwin reveals in his description of the Battle of the Bells that Dennis Arryn, the, quote, darling of the Vale, was killed at Stony Sept as well. So it's interesting to learn this detail right after Sansa's marriage chapter, given that Dennis Arryn's death is directly connected to Harry Harding, as in Harry the heir, becoming heir to the Vale, and Littlefinger's plan subsequently to marry him to Sansa. So this chapter is very subtly connected to Sansa's chapter, as well as to the history of this event for Jon and people like Hoster Tully, and obviously Ned and so many others. The way George ends this chapter is very clever. He reminds us toward the end of all the people in Arya's prayer, so we have it in our heads that the captive one should be one of those people. By framing the chapter around the Mad Huntsman, a character very closely associated with dogs, and having dogs around the captive, there's the clue that it's actually the Hound. And we get phrases like his bloody brother, which she thinks he's talking about Tyrion because they think it's the Kingslayer, but really they're talking about Gregor, things like that. So it's pretty neat it's a way to show the comparisons between these characters that we're not aware of. And it's the same sort of thing happening on a larger scale in history with these comparisons of the Battle of the Bells. So I think that's really fascinating. George is really playing with scale here and going back and forth with that.
What I thought about throughout all of that was obviously Daenerys. How can you not, with bells and them traumatizing him and haunting him? I was just giggling at the idea of Dany arrives and he hears the bells in her hair and he just freaks out.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it's funny because you're right to mention that. It's interesting that the show made that about Dany, but it seems that Dany does associate bells with victory, but John Connington is the one who has these horrible memories, and it's the one that's like traumatizing to him. So,
well, he's going to be a dragon rider.
The grayscale dragon rider. Ooh. Now, of course, this thought that he should be more like Tywin is also a tie-in to Tyrion's chapter, which is only a few from now, where Tyrion specifically thinks about how he's being more like his father in the way he handled Simon Silvertongue. And, hey, Silver Prince, Silver Tongue? Nah, not really. As much as John Connington and Ned's experiences were different at the Battle of the Bells, because one was, on the winning side, and one thought, oh my God, he blames himself for his lover's death. I mean, well, not his lover. Rhaegar was not his lover. The man he loved, he blames himself for his death. So that's a pretty rough thing to pin on yourself. And, but think about this. Both of their lives, Jon's and Ned Stark's, are wrapped up directly connected to Rhaegar and Lyanna's relationship. Ned loved Lyanna and will protect her child. Jon Con, same deal. But not Lyanna, Rhaegar, the other side of that. And, of course, it's romantic love, not familial. And he's probably not actually guarding a child of Rhaegar. But he thinks he is. I'm sorry?
As far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we know. That's the bit of the trick
Stark
there.
Incest. Sorry.
Stark-cest. Ned also loved Robert, but, not that way either. But still, John Conning...
No.
Yeah, as we know. You're right, I guess. Regardless, the general idea here is these very strong feelings between these characters. Whether it's familial or romantic or what have you, the Battle of the Bells is a huge historical drop done in a way very typical of George. It seems to be important, but it's also understated. It's actually way more important than it seems. And it's mixed in with so many other events, and it ties to these other events. Like I said, we've just connected the Battle of the Bells to a bunch of different characters, and we hardly even mentioned the fact that Hoster Tully was injured there, which is kind of a funny thing to think about considering he's about to die in his Catelyn's next chapter. And this is because so much is going on. And because the significance of things like the Battle of the Bells doesn't come for much later, or the greater significance of it doesn't come for much later. I can't even remember how difficult this was or what I thought of this chapter when I read it the first time. I probably didn't think a whole lot of it. I mean, this anecdote about the Battle of the Bells is like 2 paragraphs long, and it's right at the start. So you have this Battle of the Bells, and then before you've gone much longer, You've got like crow cages and horribly tortured people, and you don't know why they're there. And you probably forget about the Battle of the Bells pretty quickly, unless you have some sense of why it's so important. So again, the power of reread here is particularly strong in a chapter like this. So Connington spends almost 2 decades after this battle believing that this failure directly led to the death of Rhaegar. How haunted would Ned be if he thought his failure led to the death of Robert? I mean, Ned does think that he could have done more for Lyanna, but Ned never thinks, I should have been more like Tywin. That is what Jon Connington thinks, though, and that's a big ugh. I think Jon Connington learned the wrong lesson here. But wrong lesson or not, it is what drives him. And driven is a pretty fair description of Jon Connington, especially at this point, now that he's really gotten going, now that he's in Westeros, and now that he's on a ticking clock with his grayscale. I think he's going to have to move even quicker. And that is not a good thing for the realm, because the things that motivate him are, well, you don't want a guy who's coming in trying to be more like Tywin. So soon after the real Tywin has finally been gotten rid of. Footnote to what I said about the Karstarks and broken men. It's the 3 brothers that Bran overhears, meaning the Karstark brothers, the sons of Rickard Karstark. And it's the 2 youngest who make the comments about being broken. Those are the 2 killed by Jaime at the Whispering Wood. The eldest, Harrion Karstark, is not apparently, well, that we know of. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't make any rude comments about Bran's legs. And he's the one that's still alive in captivity since the Battle of the Green Fork. So despite Alice Karstark and the new Magnar of Fen claiming Karhold, the real heir to Karhold is still out there. And, well, we'll see what happens with that. He may be a bit broken himself after this captivity, considering some of that captivity came at Harrenhal. There's a serious double entendre here. Don't he like girls?
Arya shrugged. He's just stupid. He likes to polish helmets and beat on swords with hammers.
Polish helmets and beat on swords with hammers. Right, that's said in reference to, instead of wanting to sleep with Bella, this is what he likes to do. So very much a euphemism for self-pleasuring, you could say. In fact, I do say. So Nina reminds us that not only did Gendry and Bella almost sleep together, but Tyrion almost slept with 2 of the girls at Shataya's, who are probably Tywin's bastard daughters. So this would be the second almost incest, if assuming that theory is right, which I think it probably is. Tree Girl points out that the Mad Huntsman is a minor version of the kind of warlord that emerges from destruction, mass destruction, that is. There's something post-apocalyptic about this place, about Stony Sept, about how, a man with a pack of hounds is kind of running things and issuing justice and helping the people get food. He's kind of doing all the things that need taken care of, and has to, break a few eggs while doing it. Has to get dirty, has to get violent. And left alone too long, this is the kind of thing that could really go south, could really turn more violent, like the Brotherhood Without Banners does. That kind of thing, that these kind of situations where people are desperate. Well, you got to get out of that desperation, or things are going to get worse, people are going to get bad, and people are going to get more desperate. A decent man pushed far past what he used to see as decent because the world around him is no longer decent. He won't be a decent man forever. Decency is a cultural value. Decency is an agreed upon thing, and the less decency in the world, the less decent a decent person is going to be. Not everyone can just stay that grounded when the world is changing around them and you're literally starving and suffering and stressed out about whether you're even going to live to see the next sunrise. Super chat from Tommy Pappas. Can't stay long, but wanted to say hey and can't wait to listen tonight. Appreciate that, Tommy. Hey, everybody, check out the New Dads podcast. Don't forget about that. The experiences of being a new father, and Tommy is, in fact, well, he just had a second one. They had a second baby, little
Yay.
Solomon. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up, we had a nice little chat here.
Yeah?
In the chat, we were talking about the Great Stone Beast prophecy you know?
Oh, yeah.
We were just talking about it in relation to John Connington. From a smoking tower, a great stone beast took wing, breathing shadow fire. You never says dragon, so it can be a griffin.
Yeah.
And the
that's
shadow
true.
fire, people were talking about that meaning black fire.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of interesting.
That does
Anyways,
fit, yeah.
Multiple people like Khaleesi Targaryen and Lady Leaf Underhill in particular had
Cool.
thought about that in the past. So,
Good
anyways,
job, y'all. Yeah, that's a good topic. I've thought about John Connington and the Stone Beast breathing fire, but I don't think I've ever thought about the shadow fire being black fire.
I'd never really thought about the idea that it could just be a griffin. Griffins have wings.
Yeah.
I never considered that part either.
Funny too. I think we maybe have mentioned this before, but maybe not during Valar Rereadis. Just at some point in the life of the podcast, I think we've mentioned the fact that if griffins were actually a real thing, it would be the Valyrians that would make them. I think I've more referenced that about sphinxes, because we know Valyrians did engineer sphinxes. So maybe they engineered some griffins too. That would make sense to connect that to the Targaryen and Rhaegar being John Connington's love, and that would be a little bit of a connection there.
Yeah. But we'll get to all of this in more depth as we move forward.
Yeah, John Connington has barely been mentioned to this point in the actual narrative. We've just jumped ahead to tie him to these events because it's so important, and because that's one of the things we're supposed to be doing here in Valar Rereadis is connecting these dots for y'all. I imagine a lot of y'all remembered John Connington and thought about the Battle of the Bells, but most of you probably didn't actually jump ahead to read those sections. So that's why we try to bring that together for you guys to show those comparisons and to show just how tight it is and how important it is and how awesome it is to see in a book, in a great, vibrant world like A Song of Ice and Fire, to see these important events from multiple perspectives. I think that's super fun. Some people kind of think it gets bogged down. It's like, we've already seen this event, but not me. I love the different takes. That's what it's all about. Different perspectives. All right, let's move on. John 4. The gang climbs the wall, a.k.a. the one where Val becomes single. Or surprise, you're single. It's kind of like Sansa's one, but yeah. Hey, I've got my I climb and I know things shirt on today. Yes. Or that's what I do. I climb and I know things. So this was one of the shirts I had very much picked out in advance. Sometimes I'm like, what shirt fits with the chapters today? But this one was easy. The opening line is...
Ghost was gone when the wildlings led their horses from the cave.
Yeah, so we really covered that last time. Ghost does end up at Castle Black at, I think, John 12 is what I said. So that is no worries there, of course. So first-hand look here, though, at how raiding works. We've heard it talked about, the wildlings, the free folk are raiders. That's a big part of their culture. But we actually kind of see it from a ground level, like how they prepare, how they actually climb the wall. Of course, there's other types of raiding, like tunneling and taking boats around the wall. But this one seems to be the most dangerous. I mean, I would think so. Climbing the wall seems way more dangerous than a raft. But, hey, the Bay of Seals is... it's maybe the waves are worse than I thought. Anyway, John wonders how it's possible for them to keep their stamina for so long climbing that wall. And as unrealistic as the show version of this was, because John and Ygritte basically do this without any training or very little training. But this is realistic enough for the real world. In fact, I mean, this is crazy impressive and amazingly dangerous, but it's actually pales in comparison to what real life mountaineers have done in the real world for far less motivation, seemingly far less motivation, meaning no king ordered them to make these dangerous climbs. A 700-foot wall of ice is incredible, right? Isn't it? But it's incredible as an engineering feat. It's not incredible as a thing people have climbed in the history of humankind. Real-world people have climbed mountains of over 26,000 feet. So 700 feet, that really kind of pales in comparison. To think that raiders do this to steal goods might sound a bit crazy. But again, compare that to the real world. Why are these people climbing 26,000-foot mountains in the snow? It's not to get stuff. It's to be famous or to push themselves to their limits. It's a personal challenge. It's a completely different set of motivations. And you would think that in some ways it's a lot less motivation.
See, the most unrealistic thing to me is just that John does it.
Yeah, the fact that John...
The rest of them have to have been practicing. They've done it before, whatever. They're hardier, stronger. But yeah.
And that's why George has it done it the realistic way in the book, where he has them lower a rope ladder.
Yeah.
It's like, I can believe Jon could climb a 700-foot rope ladder. I believe he can handle that. But yeah, in the show, they're just like, let's do this for the first time. I've never climbed but once or twice, and I'm going to go up a 700-foot ice wall, and I'm going to multiple times be hanging by one arm. But I'll recover. It's fine. It's fine. Note that when men die from the climbing, the Thens don't hesitate to burn the bodies. Though it appears 2 of them die after falling from those ladders, so even those ladders were dangerous. No one burns those 2, but hey, it's just 2 guys. One of the ones that is burned, Jarl, excuse me, inspired the title since he was with Val, so that's why she's single now. This is another example where the real world is perhaps even more frightening. For example, not only is the climbing of the real world climbing that we just discussed probably a lot more dangerous than climbing the wall, but those bodies of the Thens that fell from the wall, that's also nothing compared to the real world. There's no cleanup crews on Mount Everest. If you ever watch a documentary about Mount Everest climbers, there's just bodies, just there, just lying off to the side, like you could see them off the side of the track. No one's gonna go get that body because it's dangerous, so it just sits there. It's like. It really gives the sense of what we're looking at here beyond the wall. Like, you got whites and dead bodies just lying there. And it's like, yeah, actually, the real world, there's not going to be any of them rising again. But it's still really damn spooky to think about. Jon's inner loyalty and sense of purpose is still strong here. Not only does he find himself hoping for a patrol to come and shoot down the climbers, which would change his outlook. Well, not while he's on the ground, but it would still change. He wouldn't have to go raiding, I suppose, or at least it would delay it. Still, he gets an opportunity to learn more about what the Free Folk are doing, being with them and learning their methods. But more importantly, he's trying to figure out this whole supernatural stuff. Qyburn ordered him to find out what kind of sorcery or artifact or what is it that they've got going on there. And it comes up here. But on the other hand, it's slightly disappointing. George R. R. Martin has this recurring pattern where someone is explaining lore or backstory, and they get interrupted for some reason. But this time, George just ends the chapter with it. There's no interruption other than the chapter stops. It just sort of ends. And the last line is this.
I'm crying because we never found the Horn of Winter. We opened 100 graves and let all those shades loose in the world and never found the Horn of Jormungand to bring this cold thing down.
Yeah, well, what does Jon say to that? What does he say next? What's his next line? What's his response? He's like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. I mean, I don't think that he's trying to be sly here. It's not like that's some big secret. Ygritte is fully convinced, bought into him being on the Free Folk side, and I doubt it's some mystery that they can't share. So she could probably tell him everything there is to know. And in his next chapter, he thinks of their descent and progress towards Castle Black. So he remembers the moments after this, but he doesn't think of anything else with regard to this conversation. So, oh well, George is just keeping us in the dark a little bit there. So it seems that Mance was forging the Free Folk into one. If we back up and try to understand what Ygritte's saying here, and his plan was probably to invade the south, carve out a kingdom, or at least be accepted into the realm, accepted to the king's peace. Was he always making them a unit because of the threat of the others? That's a part that we're not quite sure of. Was that his initial motivation, or did that become the motivation once the others started doing all this damage? If we compare Mance to past kings of Beyond the Wall, there's something unique about this because past kings Beyond the Wall probably didn't have giants in their army. Maybe some of them did. Nor were they as likely to have brought such vast numbers of non-combatants, right? All the herds and the women and children, not counting the spearwives, of course, and the men who don't fight, there's plenty of them. And that might not be the case for past kings Beyond the Wall. Like, I don't think, Gendel and Gorn brought all, women and children. I don't think that the Horned Lord did. I mean, maybe they did, but all of them? What about the battle at where Raymond Redbeard was killed and killed Willem Stark himself? We don't hear anything about non-combatants being there. That just So there's a lot of things about Mance's kingship that's different, and the others are part of why it's different, or at least why the outlook is different. That explains, in fact, part of why some of these cultures that would not have likely joined with past kings beyond the wall all of a sudden are like, well, we have to join or we die. In the past, they haven't cared about migrating south of the wall because winter isn't, they can handle the northern winters. They're tough. But this is not the northern winter they're fleeing from. They're not migrating south for the winter. They're not birds. They're fleeing the others. That's the big game-changing thing that's happened. And it sounds like maybe they were less of a threat, but became more of a threat in part because of time passing, more bodies dropping, which in turn are added to the army of the dead. And Ygritte is expressing that perhaps they contributed to that by opening all these graves, looking for the Horn of Joramun, which just increased, which did nothing. They didn't find the horn, but they definitely added more dead bodies to the army of the dead. To add to this thought, one question I had, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. Speaking of vast numbers, in Tyrion's chapter, Tywin's going to repeat the falsehood uttered by many, including the Citadel, that the lands beyond the wall cannot support vast numbers. One of the reasons for this error is that they haven't actually, checked. They just assumed. It's not the worst assumption, but it is wrong. The other reason is that those hardy people who live far to the north, like I just said, they haven't been forced south before. The winter comes and they stay there, and the south goes, no one could be living up there during that, and they're just wrong. It's an assumption that, like I said, is somewhat reasonable, but it's wrong. Those people have been dealing with winters for thousands of years up there. They know what they're doing. They can handle it. So Mance is an incredible leader, no doubt, but how much of his leadership is rooted in this common threat, in a need to unite that has literally never existed before, save for, maybe 8,000 years ago when something like this all happened before. But back then there wasn't even a wall, potentially. Lots of different things about it. Cultures were different. Technology was different. So much was different. The huge horn Mance does have that's later burned by Stannis and Mel and Selyse, as we know, is a fake. Well, it's not fake in that it's really awesome and big, but it's just that's just all it is. It's a big horn they found in an ancient grave. Even if it was magical, it's not bring the wall down magical. Here's another minor example of where we get to jump forward and get a different take. In A Dance with Dragons, Tormund, our friend, Tormund Giantsbane, has thoughts on this too.
But we never found the true horn, not for all our digging. If we had, every kneeler in your 7 kingdoms would have chunks of ice to cool his wine all summer.
Yeah, right? And this is when Tormund, this is part of why I said Ygritte has no reason to hide any of these secrets from Jon. Tormund has even less reason, though, because at this point, when this conversation is happening, the one that Shea just quoted, that's when the free folk are being allowed through the wall. There's already a deal in place for them to be allies. So Tormund really has no reason to lie at that point. The wall is already not coming down. They're already joining the 7 kingdoms, per se, at least joining Stannis. So what Tormund is saying is that if they had found the horn, they would have used it. But that's not necessarily true. Tormund may be assuming, because Mance didn't really want to bring the wall down. Mance wanted to hide on the other side of it because of the others. But he was willing to do what he had to do. So we shouldn't assume that Tormund is right about what Mance's intentions were, because we know that Mance has kept some of his intentions close to the chest. We see that. We see him keeping things from Tormund in the past. But it's also kind of what Ygritte says. But again, Ygritte knows even less than Tormund about what Mance's plans are, probably. Now, of course, the wall itself, as a supernatural thing, Ygritte, she hates the wall, right? That's another factor in why she would have loved to see it go down. She talks about it being made of blood, and this is yet another euphemism for a place, a structure, a city that's built on the backs of death, like Astapor. Bricks and blood. This is ice and blood. And of course, this is a hinge of the world that Melisandre calls it later. So there's all sorts of mystery behind it, as well as we know there's some supernatural element to it, even if we don't know exactly what it is.
So, Tormund brings up their chunks of iced cool wine all summer.
Yeah.
For people down south. 2 things. I doubt they do that up beyond the wall ever. They
Yeah.
seem to want a warm drink. But I wonder how much wildlings even get in on the game of trying to sell, export ice.
Yeah, right.
It's a real thing. They want ice
it's
down
true.
there, and they have it plentifully.
You're right. They ship you ship things in ice packed in like they talk about the crabs packed in
Tormund
ice and all
seems
that.
to know that people in the Seven Kingdoms want ice for their wine. Anyways, very mundane things we're getting down to here.
Definitely, very important nitty gritty of how the Southerners and Northerners vary in their beverages. We know that the Jorah Mormont or Jeor Mormont likes lemon in his beer, but
Yeah. I would want a nice hot drink. Yeah, not chunks of ice in the wine.
So a couple thoughts from Nina on the Ygritte's comment, different takes on what she was getting at there. Nina thinks that Mance was very deliberately looking for the horn because he had a plan for it, and in line with what we were saying, it's a trump card. He can either blackmail the Brotherhood to let him in. Blackmail? Haha.
He's gonna. Blackmail. That's really good. I was also just laughing at it. He can blackmail the wall.
Yeah, blackmail. All right, listen here, Wall.
No, that was a great unintended pun.
So, and so trump card's a good word for it. He could either say, look, if you don't let us in, we're going to use it, and if you don't let us in, then the wall's going down, and we all go down with it. So that's pretty neat. But there's also the point of opening all these graves to do it, suggesting that he thought it was buried with someone. Like, where did they get the idea that it was in a grave in the first place? It's a reasonable starting point, I suppose, but maybe there's some information there. Maybe they learned something. Maybe there's a legend that we haven't been told yet. But then it begs another question: how did Benjen find it? Assuming that the horn that Sam has is the horn of Jormungand, which I very much believe it is. Where did it come from? Did it come from a grave, or was the source, say, the Children of the Forest, as evidenced by the dragon glass cache that accompanied the horn? Tough choice. I don't know. This is a great question that we can't answer, but I think we're on the right track, or at least I think we have a lot of what it takes to be on the right track. So a third point here, Ygritte mentions releasing shades as they search. And this is a debated point, what shade actually means. Now, that's a word that's been open for interpretation. In this book, it does seem to point to specific people rather than the others, like King Renly's shade and the shades of the Kingsguard Jaime fights in his dream. But I think we found the slam dunk clue to explain what shade means to the people of Westeros. And of all people, it comes from Sir Bonifer Hasty, who is the leader of the Holy 100, the pious soldiers who are currently in charge of Harrenhal. Like, it's the real night and day Harrenhal there. Like, they think, the cursed place of Harrenhal, nothing like having the Holy 100 to balance that out. Anyway, this is what Sir Bonifer says.
I fear no shade, sir. It is written in the seven-pointed star that spirits, wights, and revenants cannot harm a pious man so long as he is armored in his faith.
Yeah, so, we've called Lady Stoneheart a revenant before, an undead being bent on revenge. That's kind of what that means. But very clearly, shade and white are equated in back-to-back sentences here, and no one says, hey, Sir Bonifer, that's not how it works. So, unless he's wrong, that does seem to be a pretty strong piece of evidence that shade means white, not other, which does absolutely fit with what Ygritte was saying, because otherwise we're left with the notion that Ygritte says, we opened up all these graves and it unleashed the others in the world. Well, that doesn't really work, though, does it? Because why were they opening the graves to get to the wall if the others weren't a threat? So yeah, this fits very nicely. I think we can kind of settle that.
I just wanted to bring up something from the chat.
Sure.
Lady Leaf Underhill said, "Is the wall easier to blackmail than to date?" That's so good. I love it.
Oh God.
Oh.
Good one.
Yeah.
Good one. Very good. Now I must retire.
Forever. No, it was really good. I had to read it twice. I was like, oh my God.
Some more thoughts from Nina. John mentions that the Sword of the Morning still hung in the south. Of course, that's the constellation. And that's also true of the actual sword, Dawn. Per George, Dawn remains at Starfall waiting for another Sword of the Morning, just kind of hanging there. It's hanging on the wall, which is kind of funny to think about. Like, someone could just take it, which I do think Darkstar might do. That's been a theory of mine for a little while. I know I'm not the only one that has that theory, but yeah, because Edric may have been set up to be the wielder of Dawn when it was first originated, but there's no 5-year gap, so Edric's going to be 12 still, or 13, and it may not be the best fit to have such a gigantic sword wielded by a 13-year-old.
A question I just thought about here is, okay, Darkstar's pretty dark, obviously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Edric is not.
Edric's a very good boy.
Yeah, the idea of there being two very different potential wielders makes me wonder, one, if Edric with Lady Stoneheart and company, if he would have gotten a lot darker, or just 5 years of terrible war would have darkened him, or whether they were both supposed to be there and there was supposed to be a conflict. I don't know.
It's night and day.
Yeah. Yes.
But I think also you got to consider that Stoneheart, the original plan for Stoneheart was that she was going to, Catelyn was going to die beyond the wall and come back.
Well, but was that even? I don't know that had happened before he scrapped his.
Oh, I agree.
Gap.
I don't know when
that was from his original.
I agree, but he may not have planned. He may have scrapped Undead Catelyn entirely until the 5-year gap brought her back.
Yes.
Because because without the 5-year gap, do you have Stoneheart?
Yeah.
I mean, has she
just been dead for 5 years?
Yeah. Is she 5 years of rampaging? Like, wow, that's a long time.
That's a good point.
So I think so he may have. It's a weird thing where he maybe have set aside the idea of Undead Catelyn and brought her back when he's like, actually, I got to get rid of this 5-year gap. So maybe let's do Undead Catelyn after all. He was probably real happy. He's like, yes, I get to do Undead Catelyn. So anyway, so back to the Dawn stuff here. We're gonna meet Edric Dane pretty soon, in fact. So this is all, you can see George is sort of dialing this plot line up a little bit, introducing it more in bits and pieces. And if we're thinking more about the wall and what Ygritte said and the supernatural elements here, Fire and Blood. Here's another, we get to actually use Fire and Blood every once in a while. It pops up with something relevant. Remember, in Fire and Blood, that Silverwing, Alysanne's dragon, Queen Aly, tried 3 times to fly beyond the wall, but Silverwing wouldn't go. She refused to pass the wall. Very interesting, isn't it? That little tidbit was from the release of Fire and Blood ahead of time, so it was we all got to think about that one before the rest of the book came out, and this is exactly where it belongs in terms of placing the lore and seeing how it might matter. So is that going to come up for Dany? Is she going to try to fly north and it's going to be not like the TV show? The dragon's going to be like, no. That's particularly interesting to me as well because Dany's dragons are so young, whereas a dragon like Silverwing was not terribly young, not old, but not young, more an adult dragon. So that's very interesting. It supports the idea that there is magic in the wall, and it supports it gives us some inkling as to what the magic does. If magical beings can't pass it, like Cold Hands, like the others, like Whites, dragons are magical beings. So it's kind of maybe an unintended consequence of keeping all magical beings from passing it, but it is consistent. And some thoughts from Joe. He wrote a really nice piece here about what the wall means to the story at this point, so I'm going to read that for y'all. I think it's really good. Despite having spent so much time at the wall during Game of Thrones and seeing it in Jon's last chapter, this chapter is unlike any other. Despite the coolness of Jon going over and Sam/Bran going under in the same book, Jon's climb is far more significant of the two. The wall is such a tentpole of the series as a whole, a pure creation of George's mind that sticks out and has made its way into pop culture. It's truly wild to see someone, a main character no less, ascend it. It's almost like a rite of passage for Jon, seeing as the man named Snow is so intimately linked to a wall of ice already. That connection is only going to grow as Jon becomes Lord Commander. The wall is mine. It is coming soon from Jon's lips. There's the symbolism as Jon is the icy guard against the others as well. But to me, this climbing of the wall represents Jon's two sides as both a Northman and now a wildling as well. As we discussed last time, Styr and Jarl, have different types of leadership and different sets of skills. I think this is super interesting. you've got it shows the strengths of the free folk as a people. In some ways, they have disadvantages because they're disparate and disunited, and Mance is holding this whole together, and a lot of them don't actually get along that well. That's not untrue in Westerosi armies. You often have like nobles who are leading different factions within an army that don't like each other, and that causes problems. And sometimes those problems are cultural. But here, we see the strength of that. It's not a problem when in a commando raid like this, you got Jarl's men who are experts at the climbing and the scouting and have done this before. Meanwhile, Styr and his disciplined men are like shock troops. So working together, you get these quality scouting raider types to bring these tough, heavy infantry to the other side of the wall to wreak havoc. So it's a really, you don't like to see it because they're going to kill innocent people, but from a logistics perspective, this is a serious military threat. These guys are using their skills very effectively to the maximum, really, you could say. All right, let's move on here. A couple of questions from y'all and comments. Matt Reese says Stoneheart, since she was introduced in the Storm of Swords epilogue, it maybe was planned to be around after the 5-year gap. So maybe she would have taken longer to get going. Yeah, maybe he had some different plan for her, that her beginning would have been slower. It's still an interesting transition from Beric to Stoneheart with a gap in there. Maybe undead Beric was added as part of that as well. It's very hard to say. The fact that the Brotherhood is back-to-back led by undead is certainly notable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I had a thing I wanted to bring up here before we leave all the Ygritte stuff. In rereading it all, I was struck by Jon's mommy issues. If you think about it, he was raised by Catelyn, a red-haired woman who's mean to him. And then he gets together with Ygritte, a red-haired woman who's mean to him. So, anyways, there's that thought for you all.
It's true, and that's a great catch, because we were distracted, as we often are, by George's use of multiple meanings where we don't catch one of the meanings. This is the one we missed, perhaps, whereas we were focused on kissed by fire and how that screams Daenerys foreshadowing, right? But
yes.
You're right, this is the reverse, where it's a piece of its past rather than a piece of its future. So that's a very good catch. Newt Rock asked back in our Discord chat, he was wondering about the trees that Jon notes at the base of the wall and how those trees are used to give one of the groups of climbers a big head start. And Jon thinks about how some of those trees have probably not been cut back for a while. And so some of these trees, they literally can take hundreds of years to get to the point they're at. And I think that might really be the case with how old some of these trees are. And that actually fits quite well with what we know about the decline of the Watch. When Aegon the Conqueror came, when he united the Seven Kingdoms, it was a bit of a death knell for the Watch. It obviously didn't kill them completely, but one of the Watch's main source of manpower was the defeated. And, well, with the King's Peace, there's just so few defeated. Obviously, past the initial conquest, during the conquest, there's plenty of defeated people. But once the king rules the whole realm and no one's allowed to go to war against each other, lords aren't allowed to go fight their neighbors anymore, well then, where are these defeated men going to come from? Who are the defeated in battle that get sent to the wall afterwards? It just stops. And remember, when Aegon the Conqueror landed, there were like 10,000 men on the wall. Maybe it was 20,000. I forget the exact number. It was a huge number, vastly more than there was now. So clearly the decline of the Watch, if it had started then, it doesn't seem to have been very deep into its decline if they still have 10, 20,000 men on the wall, right? So arguably the King's Peace is what destroyed the wall, kind of ironically. And if that's the case, if the manpower started dropping off around the time of Aegon the Conqueror, then you've got about 300 years of trees growing at the base of the wall. Let's say the decline didn't start right away, so give or take another 50, 100 years. That's still 200 years of tree growth that's largely unchecked. And that does seem to be what we're looking at, because these guys got like a 200-foot head start because of these trees. That is definitely not short-term tree growth there. Also, a little bit like Arya 5, I don't know if it's an intentional parallel, but I noticed it and I think it's worth mentioning as we move on here. One of the Thens, or rather one of the climbers, falls and has to be put out of his misery because he's not quite dead when he lands. And that reminds me of Arya and whenever putting people out of their misery in those crow cages. And this is extra poignant because Jon and Arya having a similar thing happening around them there's a little extra meaning to that because of their strong connection that we all hope is able to, be restored at some point. Okay. Jaime for the one with Thappireth, a.k.a. Qyburn's Stump service, but not Stump removal service, which is normally what these type of businesses, these tree services, call themselves. Jaime tells Qyburn he wants to keep as much of his arm as possible, despite the risk. It sounds horribly painful, and the various ways Jaime is learning to experience pain is a big part of this chapter, like the first sentence.
His hand burned.
So there's a little bit of a joke there, isn't it? His hand burned. Lots of hands burned that Jaime saw while he was working for Ares, among other things.
Real good.
Part of the reason the pain is so bad beyond the obvious, I mean, his hand was cut off, so we're starting from a point of, yeah, that sounds painful, but it's become infected, so that's really bad. On top of that, it seems that the psychological pain outweighs the incredible physical pain. Because Jaime's talent and lifestyle and attitude are all about swordsmanship. He decides he's nothing. He says he's nothing. Only when Brienne calls him a craven does that kind of shock him out of that dark reverie. She tells him, look, you can still get revenge. And from there, he builds on that. He thinks of other reasons to stay alive beyond revenge, such as, well, quote.
Craven, Jaime thought, as Brienne fought to stifle her moans. Can it be? They took my sword hand. Was that all that I was, a sword hand? Gods be good. Is it true? The wench had the right of it. He could not die. Cersei was waiting for him. She would have need of him. And Tyrion, his little brother, who loved him for a lie. And his enemies were waiting too. The young wolf who had beaten him in the Whispering Wood and killed his men around him. Edmure Tully, who had kept him in darkness and chains. These brave companions.
One point of debate or discussion on our social media platforms was what he means by that line, Tyrion, his little brother who loved him for a lie. Is he talking about the Tysha lie? I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely.
It kind of could be. Some people think maybe it's just a turn of a phrase, but I think it's probably more direct towards that. And that fits so well because of Tyrion and Sansa's marriage, where his thoughts about being loved and being unlovable are really coming to the surface. So. And
we see Tyrion then be betrayed later on for loving him despite his lies.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So the stuff with his family, with Jaime, that's complicated and more of an ongoing thing. But we can wrap up some of these other points more simply here. Obviously, he doesn't have to worry about Robb going forward, right? That's going to be over with pretty soon, even though he's thinking about it now. Lady Stoneheart, though, and the Blackfish, so he does still have to worry about Starks and Tullys. It's just not necessarily Edmure and Robb, because Edmure he's going to actually get, quote-unquote, some revenge on. Although by the time he arrives at River Run, he's not thinking about revenge. He's thinking about doing a good job. He's thinking about being honorable and doing the best he can. So he's not vindictive towards Edmure by that point, but they do have this very memorable scene where Edmure surrenders River Run, and Jaime does send him in chains to Casterly Rock. So that is sort of a turnabout, fair play of sorts. And although we can't really say the circle is complete, there's a lot of skepticism in the fandom that I largely agree with, that Edmure will not reach that dungeon. We do know that the Winds of Winter prologue is going to take place in this general area, perhaps featuring Edmure's trip in chains towards Casterly Rock with Jane Westerling along. So that could get very interesting. Blackfish and maybe Nymeria, Queen of the Riverlands, could both be involved. Lady Stoneheart, ooh, that's going to be exciting. But we'll have to wait on that. Jaime also mentions Zollo, the guy who cuts his hand off, and these brave... Well, he doesn't say Zollo specifically. He mentions the brave companions, and of course he's thinking of Zollo and some of the others. Zalo is still alive, so that's one he might still get. And speaking of revenge, the 3 men who come to try and rape Brienne are Zalo, so again, he's still out there, but the other 2 are Shagwell and Rorge, and Brienne kills them both separately in a feast for crows, so she gets her revenge. That's nice to see. The trickle of memory continues for Jaime as he sees the spot he knelt to receive his white cloak when they arrive at Harrenhal. Interestingly, he thought he was a free man going to be rewarded and to achieve glory at Harrenhal before he realized he was just kind of a possession of King Aerys. And this place that he knelt to receive his white cloak, he says, is now a privy trench. And I think this is some of George's sense of humor here, because what did Jaime say about the white cloak? That it soiled him. So the spot he knelt to receive the cloak that soiled him is now a place completely soiled by human waste. So how about that? It seems that mockery is the norm for him at Harrenhal. He's forced to replay much of that same shame that he faced from Aerys. And the brave companions are insulting him and mocking him, and they don't even realize how effective their mockery is, because they don't realize they're calling back all this Harrenhal, Aerys, Kingsguard stuff. It's just kind of an accident, an unhappy accident for Jaime. If they knew how well they were getting him with these insults, they would laugh even louder. Quote,
"A spear jabbed at the small of Jaime's back, sending him sprawling. Instinct made him put out his hands to stop his fall. When his stump smashed against the ground, the pain was blinding, yet somehow he managed to fight his way back to one knee. Before him, a flight of broad stone steps led up to the entrance of one of Harrenhal's colossal round towers. 5 knights and a Northman stood looking down on him. The one, pale-eyed in wool and fur, the 5 fierce in mail and plate, with the Twin Towers sigil on their surcoats."
So this is seriously like his receiving of the cloak. Just as he knelt to receive that cloak, he's sent to one knee here as well. The huge steps are a bit reminiscent of the Iron Throne, although the Iron Throne obviously isn't present at Harrenhal. Still, I can't help but notice that. And there's the same number of people. 5 knights and a Northman looking down on him. Well, that is a parallel to the 6 Kingsguard brothers, who were all there for his induction ceremony. We know all 6 of them were there. So instead of 6 Kingsguard, it's Bolton and 5 Freys. Instead of fighting to crown the Maid of Love and Beauty, men are fighting over a woman to rape her. When he got his white cloak, he was sent back to King's Landing right away before the tournament. Here, it's not that different. He is similarly sent to King's Landing by Roose, not until the next chapter, but still pretty soon after. He has like a dinner and gets his bath and his hand cleaned up by Qyburn, but then he's sent on to King's Landing. And this, of course, is just before Roose hands the castle over to Vargo and gives Brienne to Vargo, who then puts her in the bear pit after she bites his ear off. Hoat laughs about his plan to rip Tywin off by getting a ransom for Jaime, then claiming the reward from Lord Karstark instead, which is a funny thing to be blabbering about with Jaime right there and Roose Bolton still in charge of the castle, and Roose Bolton being on Tywin's side at this point. Well, maybe not on side, but as an ally, so not the smartest man to reveal your plans to like that, Hoat. And Roose points out that that's not going to work because Karstark is dead. You're not going to claim anything from him, which reminds us of Roose being very well informed of what's been happening. And of course, Hoat wants a ransom for Brienne, expects a bag of sapphires, and this, in a twisted way, helps keep Brienne safe because Hoat, of course, isn't concerned with her health or anything like that. He just wants to get that bag of sapphires and feels like if anyone touches her, that'll ruin that. But later, that all falls off because Vargo is going to keep holding out for the sapphires, doesn't get them, is offered 300 dragons, which Jaime says is normal. But Hoat says, no way, I want sapphires. And so he just changed his mind. He's like, well, I'm going to not get the sapphires. Instead, I'm going to go rape her. And that's when she bites his ear off. So had to run through all that series of events there to connect the dots. But it's extremely It's extremely noteworthy that the Freys have left Robb at Riverrun, but are still here with Roose Bolton. That's a bit of a difference. It's interesting. For one thing, the Freys aren't all on the same page about everything. But on another matter, they do mention Robb's broken marriage proposal. So just to be clear, they know it's happening. They could have headed back to the twins and discussed like the Freys with Robb did. But these guys are with Roose Bolton. That's part of why they're there. Aenys Frey, Hostine Frey, and Danwell Frey are mentioned. Hostine and Danwell have the same mother as Fat Walda, and that's who Roose Bolton married. So it's easy to see why they're kind of sticking together. And Aenys and Hostine will be among those who head north with Roose and Walda. Aenys, of course, is going to die outside Winterfell in a pit trap, and Hostine is who Stannis calls Sir Stupid, but he's also the guy that slashed open Wyman Manderly's throat. So these characters are going to also, like a lot of the Freys, are going to become more prominent later because the Freys become more prominent later, and a lot of them are targets of revenge. A take from Nina here that I like: there seems to be a level of uncertainty among the Freys as to their allegiance. While Aenys is taking the anti-Robb position, Danwell actually yells out about beheading Jaime for King Robb's cause. And just so there's some confusion as to where their loyalties lie there. Even Lord Walder and Roose, or rather, even though Lord Walder and Roose have almost certainly decided on the Red Wedding by this point, it seems that not all the Freys have learned that. And how could they? Because there's Freys scattered all over the place. They can't. It's not like there's some sort of Frey hotline for them to check in on. So as long as they're in the dark, as long as they haven't reconnected with the rest of their family, they haven't learned of everything yet, because apparently Roose didn't tell them. Here's a quote that's important.
Lord Stannis was caught between your father and the fire. It said the imp set the river itself aflame. Jaime saw green flames reaching up into the sky, higher than the tallest towers, as burning men screamed in the streets. I have dreamed this dream before. It was almost funny, but there was no one to share the joke.
So put yourself in Jaime's shoes for that one. The notion that his brother Tyrion was using wildfire to defend King's Landing, that's a bit of an uncomfortable thought, from considering Jaime's thoughts are very slowly turning and consistently thinking about killing Aerys to defend King's Landing from wildfire. And of course, this is tricky for a first-time reader, because at this point you still don't know that Aerys was going to blow up King's Landing. There's just been little trickles of that information, little hints of that, but it's the next chapter, the bathtub scene, where he actually spells it all out, and it's no longer subtle. It's flat out stated. Nina says this is foreshadowing for the next chapter, for that exact moment, going away. He thinks of going away inside as he watched Aerys burn Rickard, and as Qyburn mentions the Blackwater, Jaime thinks about green flames and burning men screaming in the streets as a dream he's dreamed before. No one burned in the streets of King's Landing during Tyrion's use of wildfire. It was all flung to the outside of the city. So Jaime's clearly, when he thinks of what he's been told about Tyrion, he's clearly envisioning the version where Aerys does it, because he's thinking about people dying inside King's Landing. Interestingly, too, this is a great catch. Nina points out that line that Jaime goes away inside. Tommen does that, too. Tommen mentions going away inside. I think it's in A Feast for Crows.
It's also an incredibly common phrase for trauma.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it is.
People will describe it in that exact way.
Okay, good to know. And obviously, in this case, I'm connecting it because it's Jaime and his son that are having the same thought. But you're right. That is, it's the common parlance of people who have suffered trauma, and not just from a family connection.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell George, obviously, how can he not, writing about trauma for so many characters, have read extensive materials on this.
Probably he's read other authors that have also described trauma in terms that are probably pretty personal to them, and whatever. He may have some trauma too.
It's true.
Maybe it's in his family, someone of his relatives. Who knows? Yeah.
All we know is it wasn't war.
That's true. It wasn't war. All right, moving on. A few takes from Joe. It was Joe, by the way. It was Joe's take, that pun, the first time he saw a hand burn. Got to give Joe credit for that joke. Very good one. Not the first hand Jaime's watched burn. Also, this Joe points to this bridge between Jaime and Tyrion. Jaime's life and efforts as a skilled knight, mocked and abused by Shagwell here. In the same way, Tyrion's efforts from the Blackwater and as a fighter are mocked by the fools and dwarfs at the Purple Wedding. Because, as we know, that's part of Littlefinger's plan to embarrass Tyrion at the Purple Wedding, which he gives that idea to Joffrey, and Joffrey's like, ooh, yeah, good idea. That'll embarrass Tyrion, yeah. That's Joffrey for you. There's a nice little hidden, subtle quote that Joe caught here. Jaime twisted his head upward for a look. That's your bloody wolf, true enough, he granted her, and those are heads to either side of it. That could be a little Red Wedding foreshadowing there. Bloody wolf's heads? Especially because they're arriving at Harrenhal where there's Freys and Boltons, who are the ones next to Tywin most responsible for the Red Wedding. So, yeah, that's a really good catch. Another take from Nina here. Jaime wearing the hand around his neck seems like an allusion to the poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The phrase, to wear an albatross around your neck, comes from that poem where the Ancient Mariner is forced to wear the body of the albatross he shot down as a reminder of the bad luck that was brought on them after the albatross's death and the guilt he feels from it. Now, we got to explain a little bit here. It was considered in that era, maybe still now, I'm not up on all my sailor knowledge, but that was a thing. It was bad luck to kill an albatross, and he did that. And then in this poem after that, they have horrible luck, bad things happen, no rain, etc. I know that song because of the Iron Maiden version. Nina brought up the actual literature version, but I was like, I know the Iron Maiden version of that. So it is a good song, though. Now, Jaime mentioned in his interview with Catelyn, I like that turn of phrase there, or that choice of word there, at River Run, that he was loved by one for a kindness he never did. But in this chapter, Jaime specifically thinks of Tyrion, who loved him for a lie. So this is more talk about whether or not that refers to Tysha. Nina agrees that it does. Me and Shea seem to agree with that as well. We already know that Jaime was the one who chased off the men attacking Tysha, and that Jaime told Tyrion he had arranged it and paid Tysha to have sex with him. But this is a very early hint that that story wasn't true. So this is probably our first hint that the story wasn't true. And it's just like no way a first-time reader could possibly catch that. I mean, they don't have any idea that the Tysha story isn't true. There's no reason to think that there's lies behind that. Well, I mean, a suspicious mind, a clever person might think of that. I shouldn't shut that door completely. But honestly, that's super hard to catch. So that's a theme of these chapters today. It's a constant theme, but today in particular, it seems like we've had a lot of examples of stuff that's just no chance you could catch it on a first read. A lot of those examples today, it feels like. Qyburn's interest in Brienne at the end of the chapter is particularly disturbing. Speaking of things we're not clear on, look at this line. Qyburn did not look a monster, Jaime thought. Whoa there. Qyburn is about as bad as any character in all of the Song of Ice and Fire. And it made me think, like, Vargo Hoat is worse for the Riverlands than Qyburn. But I would rather be a young girl left alone with Vargo Hoat than with Qyburn. And that is a really disturbing realization about how bad Qyburn is.
That is a good point. That's a very good point.
Like, from a policy perspective, Vargo Hoat is worse for the realm, probably. But, like, would you rather be left alone with? Damn. Wow. So that's just really...
depends on what your role is in this regime.
True. Because Qyburn might also just be like, man, just not care. He's like, well, I have enough students. I have enough subjects to experiment on.
I need a student.
Yeah.
But he might, he needs helpers. He doesn't just only need people to experiment on.
Yeah.
So, depends on who you are, like with most regimes.
So, yeah. So that's what Nina was getting at about the whole monster quote, is that he asks about Brienne. And Jaime's like, oh, yeah, she's my protector. He doesn't know what Qyburn's getting at, that he might have wanted Qyburn might have been wanting to work on Brienne at this stage already. So good thing that didn't go that way. a couple of people notice that Jaime's sewn up with cat gut, which is a funny thing for a lion to have sewn into his missing hand. So more about Qyburn, though. He serves with Hoat, and then later Gregor kills Hoat, and then later Qyburn resurrects Gregor. So that's kind of twisted. And of course, this all will be under the protection and command of Cersei, right? Jaime has no idea that not only is Qyburn this awful, awful Dr. Mengele horror film character, but it's his own sister that's going to enable him to be as bad as he's ever been. I mean, Qyburn, with the brave companions, he has limited ability to do his worst, which is saying something because, man, do they do awful things. But given like a laboratory and a dungeon, he's just so much worse than he ever was with them, which is another thing. It just like blows my mind. It's like, yeah, Qyburn was worse under Cersei than he was with the brave companions. Like, what? It's like, damn. And I think this is going to be a bigger deal in the books than it was in the show because Jaime didn't really ever care that much about Qyburn and the mountain and all that. He was clearly put off by it, you know, but he wasn't like, what have you done?
Like,
what is this? Is an abomination, you know?
Yeah, it's true. He wasn't.
He was just kind of like looked side-eyed, just like,
no, you brought him back to life. Okay.
So I think this is something that George can use as a point to divide them even further, where Jaime is disgusted and terrified by all this, and Cersei's like, what's the big deal? You know? So, but along those same lines, tying all that together with cat gut or otherwise, Jaime is thinking in this chapter how he's meant to die with his sister. Right after Brienne gives him that kick in the pants with the verbal kick in the pants by calling him a craven. That's one of the first places his mind goes, is that he's meant to die with her. And, well, so that implies if that happens, kind of like it did on the show, maybe the circumstances will be different, but the point of them dying together could happen, then that means he's going to forgive her for worse things than she ever did on TV because... I mean, given what we just talked about and the things that she's doing in the books are worse than what she did on TV. So it's gonna be even more tragic if Jaime forgives her and goes back to her after these larger list of worse things that she's done. Anyway, Archmaester Rennie points out a subtle thing that's going on in Jaime's head as part of his transition is that he's thinking about the difference between the truth and being honorable, whereas the complete truth isn't always the best thing. Like he thinks about, well, if I was telling the complete truth here, I wouldn't have lied about sapphires on the Sapphire Isle. But clearly this was a good lie that saved someone's life. So he's kind of working through his mind about, you know, what honesty really means and the difference between honesty and honorable. And that's a really good catch because it's very subtly presented. And he's very early in this process. I mean, at one point he still blames Brienne for his hand being cut off. He hasn't taken responsibility for that yet. But of course, this isn't all going to happen overnight. He's got to work his way through it. So I appreciate that this is a process.
Definitely something that Ned would have gone through, too.
Ooh, good point, yeah.
I mean, honor and being honest.
Very true, very true. Wow, you're right, yeah. Like, the straight truth would have gotten Lyanna or Jon killed and fractured his relationship with Robert and all that, yeah. Tree Girl points out the intimacy of Jaime and Brienne in these scenes where they're doing the kind of things that only people who really love each other would actually do for each other if the circumstances were different. Of course, circumstances are part of what's up here. These are, like, who cleans up each other? You don't clean up vomit and crap from somebody you don't like.
Sometimes I don't like our cats that much. Yes.
So, but they're not doing it just because they love each other. I don't think that's happened yet. They don't love each other yet. But it's establishing that they're both decent people doing what they have to do. It's like, well, no one else is going to clean up his mess, so I'm going to do it because I'm a decent person. But it's still, they're going through the motions of something that you generally only do for people you really care about. Like, this is the kind of thing that people don't even want to do for their kid. Like, you pay people to clean up their messes like that. So I think that's a pretty poignant moment of intimacy to show that even though it's gross, it's still it's also very much not gross in that it's a interesting point of intimacy that you don't usually see. And a kind of intimacy that doesn't come off as intimate unless you're maybe thinking about it in that light. Okay, let's go to our last chapter of the day. Tyrion 4, the one with Ice Reforged, a.k.a. the gang makes singers stew. Really, though, it's the longest chapter of the day. It's the only one that's above the average length of chapters in this batch. Remember, the average length is about 35, 36 minutes. This one, I think, was 41. All the others were 30 or less. The Jon chapter was only 17 minutes. So, like I said, a broad number of subjects are briefly touched on in this one. It's kind of a big download of lots of different things. It's just that I do think the Valyrian steel stuff is among the biggest mysteries for us to ponder here, especially given how left alone it was by the TV show, and how we were just thinking about some of those things because of Jon and all that stuff with the grit and the wall and Melisandre and all that. Here's the first line of the chapter.
Nothing remained beyond the king's gate but mud and ashes and bits of burned bone. Yet already there were people living in the shadows of the city walls and others selling fish from barrows and barrels.
Yeah, we'll come back to that bit in a second. He wants Shae to have been sad about him marrying Sansa, but this is silly of him. She has always known he'd get married. He wants her to be immature about it and doesn't realize she's being mature about it because he doesn't know the difference. Tyrion is just very, very... I mean, clueless is kind of a harsh word, but it's a fairly accurate description of how he understands women. I don't want to say, clueless, helpless maybe works pretty well, because sometimes his heart's in the right place, but he's just so far apart from the perspective of someone like Shae or Sansa, and he doesn't realize how far apart his perspective is, and he doesn't realize how naive he is about understanding some of these people. He thinks he's a lot closer to the mark when he's not. Now, to be fair, this lack of understanding is a two-way street. Shae and Sansa don't know what it's like to be Tyrion. Heck, Tywin doesn't know what it's like to be Tyrion. Cersei doesn't know what it's like to be Tyrion. So this is a big factor overall in Tyrion being a very isolated, lonely person. He can't connect to people, and when he does find these connections, he makes them into something they're not, especially with Shae. It's a constant theme that he's making Shae into something that she's not. He thinks of her as and he even knows it, but he doesn't know all of it. He doesn't understand the nuance of his own semi-delusions, and a lot of this leads to his descent later. Sansa's misery is understandable, of course. Tyrion's is understandable too, but for very different reasons. And from Tyrion's point of view, Sansa's a constant reminder that he's not good enough, and that he has urges that disgust him. He wants her to want him, and that disgusts him too. It's an escalation of self-loathing. So I have a lot of sympathy. I have a lot of sympathy for Sansa, but I think it's easy to miss that there's a lot of reason to be sympathetic to Tyrion too, which is funny because usually it's the female characters that get forgotten about. But Tyrion is the one. I think it's one thing really interesting about Tyrion is that since the books were written, he's a character that has really been viewed differently over time. I think that a lot of people just plain up thought of him as a good guy with some dark elements to him. But now the discourse around Tyrion has really changed a lot the last few years. Part of it's TV, part of it's just cultural values have changed, part of it is just people know the books better, and we see a lot of these subtle things more, and we're aware of where they're leading, which is what we didn't know before. I think that's one of the big things, is seeing where this is going, where we didn't have a sense of that with Tyrion. With Sansa...
Real quick with Tyrion, though.
Yeah.
I also think you're talking about people reacting to the TV show.
Yeah.
I think part of that is that they see him portrayed as very good.
Yeah.
And so there's blowback, and that people have to re-examine, well, he's not that good. And then as they think about it more, they come to terms with his darkness.
I think you're very right there, and I think that's you're right. There's some pushback on D&D misinterpreting where Tyrion's arc was going, and that is annoying to people because they're like, why did you make the dude the good guy and the woman the bad guy?
Yeah, and so people went back and they, really analyzed it even more, I think.
And as we've been seeing in Dany's chapters, you look at it and you see that it looks like she's heading towards good. There's more evidence to her thinking about, she thinks about the common people and and their plight. Tyrion does not think about that kind of stuff. In fact, Tyrion, in this chapter, he thinks of common people as rats.
Yeah.
It's pretty dark. Like, when you really are looking for these things, it's like, wow. So that's why maybe I've focused too much on Tyrion in this Tyrion-Sansa marriage, but that's why. It's not because he's the man. It's because Tyrion's the one that we're all very much reconsidering. I think Sansa has been reconsidered by some people because a lot of people just didn't take Sansa seriously enough.
Yeah, now they're like, oh, she is going to be queen in the north.
Yeah,
like,
so
that's her. Like, that's one I don't doubt. That'll happen.
Agree. Yeah. So there's rehabilitation of Sansa's image as well, but it's not. It's a positive. It's like they're bringing her out and they're like, Sansa's better than a lot of people thought. But a lot of people were already there. But I think the revelation that Tyrion is actually kind of a bad guy was certainly not unknown, but it wasn't widely spoken of in the fandom. So I think that's a big part of this is reconsidering reconsidering Tyrion. And it's this scenes like this that really remind us that it's not all bad for Tyrion, but it's also just him trapped and us having more ability to put ourselves in Sansa's shoes than Tyrion's as well, because I don't know what it's like to be a 12-year-old girl, but I know even less what it's like to be Tyrion. It's just like that's farther away. It's strange to think of it that way, but yep. So back, what I was saying is he's having this escalation of self-loathing, and a lot of that is because he's constantly reminded that he's not the type of person that Sansa would ever want. And Sansa, to a lot of people, is the sort of an avatar of a young, noble girl. She's just so courteous and polite and sweet and beautiful, and it's like you can understand why that's the sort of societal goal for a man in Westeros, is to have someone like Sansa as your wife. Like, that's the top achievement. It's kind of gross, but you can see why that's been beaten into these men, she's the ideal. And so to have the ideal woman, yeah, she's not a woman, but to have the ideal person disgust him is so deep of a pain that it's hard to get to, like, to understand how big of a rejection that is, to have the pinnacle of society find him utterly disgusting. And it's made worse by all the people mocking Tyrion. Tyrion hears the whispers of how he's not man enough to sleep with his wife. He's being mocked for not sleeping with a 12-year-old. It's like there's nothing he can do here that makes him look good. Damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Shae, now Sansa, then after killing his father, this is his descent towards rock bottom. I think killing his father is when he actually hits rock bottom, although arguably some of the things he does across the Narrow Sea are even worse. We'll see. We'll get to that when we get there. It's getting a little too far ahead of ourselves. But some of this escalation, if we get back to this chapter, the escalation of Tyrion's darkening, if you want to call it that, can be shown in the comparison of murders here. Tyrion had Alar Dîm thrown in the ocean and Simon Silvertongue thrown in the stew. Is it really that different? Yes. There's a huge difference here. Alar Dîm was a baby-murdering psycho. Simon is an extortionist. Clearly, these are both bad deeds, but one is so incredibly and vastly worse than the other. Simon deserved something. I don't know if he deserved to be murdered, though, and it seems to me this is an awful lot like the problem that Tyrion's siblings faced. Killing someone who might reveal a problematic relationship. Obviously, Bran wasn't going to extort Jaime and Cersei, but they were worried about what he would say. But Cersei said we could have scared him into silence. And that's probably true for Tyrion as well. The threat of death is probably enough to back Simon off his greedy plan. In fact, if you recall, Simon was afraid of Tyrion at first. It was only after Tyrion showed that he wasn't quite so vicious, or at least didn't act vicious, that Simon was like, hey, actually, maybe I can extort this guy. So if he had, put the fear of Tywin into Simon, which he's capable of doing, as he, talks about, or if he had offered to pay him off, which he does also think about doing in this chapter. He's got, a pack of gold in his jacket that he decides to leave there when he hears what Simon really has to say. But it was like 30 gold pieces. Come on, man. That's not much of a bribe. You got more money than that. Or give him what he wants. Get him, put Simon on the roll of singers for the wedding. What's the big deal? Again, maybe it sounds like I'm saying Tyrion should just allow himself to be pushed around. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying killing him was not the only option. And you can think killing and extortion is not evil, but still realize that it's not noble. It's not a WWND. What would Ned do? He would not do this. On top of that, don't just let Bronn vanish the dude's body into stew. That's kind of funny in a way, but it's also like, it's gross, and it shows the same subconscious contempt that Tyrion has for commoners. And this is his father's influence, though. His father is not, or is a lot worse than him. He's more severe, more cruel. But that's a low bar. Saying Tyrion is nicer to commoners than Tywin is really not saying much. Again, he thinks of them as rats because they're trying to live. He burned the waterfront to make it harder for Stannis, and then he thinks, oh, these people are just coming back. It's hard to keep them out of here. These are human beings, man. But it's a two-way street. As long as we're considering that Tyrion is not dehumanizing these people, this is the real challenge with Tyrion, because they are dehumanizing him at the same time. Yeah, I think Tyrion should take the high road here, have the grace to understand why they hate him, which isn't just his appearance. He thinks that it's all about, I saved their city, they should be nice to me. It's not that simple. He blew them out of their homes. Like, they have a good reason to be upset with him, and he should have the grace to understand that. But regardless of whether you agree with Tyrion's decision to kill Simon, the matter of how he frames it is separate and very telling and very disturbing. He thinks his father would have been maybe not proud, but approving of how he dealt with Simon Silvertongue. So what have we just calculated here? Tywin, yeah, good job with Simon Silvertongue. Ned would not approve. So use those moral compasses. Tywin agrees, Ned says no, so what do you think? What do you think? Is it the right move for Tyrion? The one that Tywin agrees with, and Ned wouldn't? So this is obviously not, regardless of your take on here, wanting to be like Tywin or just actually being like Tywin, set aside the wanting, is not a good thing for Tyrion or anyone. He's later going to refer to killing Simon as, I killed him because he annoyed me. And it's in a moment of frustration, and it almost sounds like more of his self-loathing. He's not proud of it. And that reflects back on initially when he does it. Here in this chapter, this is the quote immediately following him issuing these orders and having these thoughts.
Tyrion spurred to a trot. He wanted a bath, and the hotter the better.
It's like he knows that he's done dirty here, and it's that metaphor of cleansing himself.
Hold on, I didn't actually manage to click the button.
Oh.
Tyrion spurred to a trot. He wanted a bath, and the hotter, the better.
Yeah, so it's as if what he knows he's done is dirty. He's like, I need to cleanse him. It's a pretty common metaphor in fiction for someone to scrub themselves and take a hot bath after they've done something emotionally disgusting, or something that they aren't proud of, or something that makes them hate themselves. Songs haven't been quite as prominent the last stretch of chapters, though they're certainly prominent, here and there, and they're going to peak again soon. But Hands of Gold are always cold. That's going to stay with Tyrion. He's going to remember those lyrics. He's going to specifically quote them to himself in A Dance of Dragons while aboard the Celisori Corrin with Penny and Makoro and all them. The lyrics are pretty cutting, after all. They're pretty good lyrics, I got to say. And it's really something to have a song written about you, even though it's, not flattering. Bloodraven had songs written about him too, and we've gone on before, especially in our Bloodraven series, about the comparisons between him and Tyrion, such as being hated, partly for their appearance, and overseeing some particularly bad times, and kind of being ruthless, though. That too. But they also both had a lot of things pinned on them that they didn't do. So it's a kind of their reputation is sort of undeserved, but there are things they've done that's deserving of hatred. So it's a little of column A, a little of column B. And one of the things people are hating Tyrion for is the thing that the Tyrells are alleviating somewhat, which is the lack of food in the city. And we're told here that food is still very expensive, even though the Tyrells are bringing food. So maybe I shouldn't be complaining about Bronn putting Simon in the stew after all. Just kidding. So Tywin is almost being the better man here than his son, which is wild because we're bashing on Tyrion a bit this chapter, while also reminding ourselves of the humanity of who he is and how difficult it is to be Tyrion. So it's kind of strange to see Tywin actually behaving better in a sense, because Tywin is like, no, get that waterfront rebuilt, no matter what, or I'll find a hand of the master of coin who will. Now, Tywin's not doing this out of goodwill, but that is a really important part of the economy that a lot of people's jobs dependent on these markets being open and people being able to do business and sell things. Like, that's Tyrion's just not thinking about how important that is to common people and living decently. And again, Tywin's not either, but just by accident, Tywin is being a better person here in that sense. Now, to be fair, Tyrion says he's going to do it. He's going to get it done. He's not slacking. He's not, doing a bad job or trying to sabotage the effort here. But he does argue over money with his father, and it's clear that it's something we've talked about before. It comes up every once in a while. Tywin's rich, and you think of him being good with money, but he's not. He's bad with money, just like some of these other nobles are. They think the craft of ledgers and economics is beneath them. It's a common theme with nobles in Westeros. Money is for other people to deal with. They're about power, and money is part of power, but money is not a social a thing that brings social potence, really. There's all these families that are described as high in honor but weak in money. That's because Westeros values the nobility and their high birth more than how much cash they have. So that's kind of something that we have to separate from our modern society, where, quite frankly, cash does equate a lot with success and greatness, especially in the Western world, especially in America, where a lot of times rich people are just considered better, which is nonsense, but is a factor of our society. So it's hard to, you got to realize that that's not the case in Westeros. Wealth does not make you, it does give you power just like it does in the real world, but it's not something that society looks on as great. And under the radar topic from this chapter is Pycelle bringing the letter. The same letter Davos reads to Stannis. It's like, whoa, that's the same letter. Yeah, it's the same one sent out all around. The same one that convinces Davos to make his move, and the same letter that Stannis forgives him over the Edric Storm matter and decides to sail to the Wall to defend the kingdom, to win the throne, rather than to the other way around. Tywin is still only willing to help the Watch, though, if they name Janos Slynt commander. Though let's not forget he was also willing to deal with Mance Rayder. He stated that in the last Tyrion chapter. The Wall is supposed to be neutral. So here we have another example of Tywin just tradition. What's that? I don't care. It's just ruthless pragmatism and pride, of course. He's annoyed by mention of 5 kings. Even Pycelle is like, well, news travels slowly there. They didn't know. Even Pycelle is defending the Watch a little bit here. So it's a big deal, though. Pycelle, what he doesn't do is he's talking about the free folk. He mentions them. The letter implies things worse than free folk. It implies, shadows moving, things like that. The kind of thing that really gets Melisandre's attention. She's like, whoa, let me see that letter. Oh, my goodness. Pycelle doesn't bring that up at all, though. So, that's interesting. Speaking of fighting the undead, well, here in this chapter, Ice Reforged, our chapter's half namesake. Another example of Tywin breaking tradition. Even this. Usually even defeated houses get their Valyrian steel back. It's like ransoms. You just generally don't, that doesn't change hands just because of it gets captured. You pay a ransom to get it back. Remember, it was part of the negotiations between Lannister and Stark, the return of ice. So Tywin's just like, well, clearly we're not going to give that back. But it's also a clue for the Red Wedding. Tywin has no intention of negotiating with the Starks, even though they still have Lannisters in captivity, even though news of Kevin's children dying just came this chapter. So Tywin's not really showing any obvious sympathy for his brother there by, melting down this piece of this thing that could help trade back Kevin's children, the one who's maybe more in danger now after what happened with Karstark. So remember, that's brought up early in this chapter, that Tyrion and Tywin are working closer together than they would because the workload is up for all of them because Kevin's not there. And Kevin is usually relied on to do quite a lot. So the circumstances of all this, of the sword being cut in half, and Ned and the Tywin breaking tradition, well, the swords themselves, they're pretty dark too. The quote is like waves of night and blood upon some steely shore. How is that supposed to not evoke uneasy thought? I mean, it sounds really cool. That sword sounds badass, but it sounds kind of evil, doesn't it? I mean, night and blood upon some steely shore. That doesn't sound like a weapon of a hero. Anyway, quote.
Your Lord Father had asked for the crimson of your house, and it was that color I set out to infuse into the metal. But Valyrian steel is stubborn. These old swords remember, it is said, and they do not change easily. I worked 100 spells and brightened the red time and time again, but always the color would darken, as if the blade was drinking the sun from it.
Drinking the sun from another thing, it's just like, yeah, it doesn't sound good. This is like very dark overtones.
Yeah, there's Lightbringer and Sun Drinker.
Yeah, so this is, that was Tabho Mott speaking. It's very unsubtle, I suppose. Nina says that Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper have this color of blood, no matter what, because these swords were made from the murder of Ned Stark, and they're going to be given away once Robb and his men have been murdered. Yeah, so it's really the Stark blood, you could say, is being highlighted there. And I definitely agree with that take, but I also think it's important to point out the wording used here. These old swords remember. Set that next to the phrase "the North remembers." Obviously applicable, given it's ice, this sword from the North. And as usual, there's room for lots of meanings here. In addition to those various meanings we've just explained, I think there's another one here. Think about the later revelations in the World of Ice and Fire. For example, we learn that the making of Valyrian steel requires human sacrifice, apparently. And then consider the story of Azor Ahai and Nissa, which sounds kind of like human sacrifice. Maybe she was a willing sacrifice, maybe not. But either way, a sword driven into her chest to make, temper that blade, to finish it. It sounds similar, doesn't it? So Tywin's doing a minor version of this. Instead of sacrificing people, he's sacrificing honor and tradition and any consideration for what his loyal brother is feeling, or whatever else you think should be said about Tywin or laid at his feet. It's all about acquiring Valyrian steel, something he's been greedy about for a long time. But the symbolic interpretations here, there's so many. Much has been written on the splitting of ice as a symbolic moment, what it means for the Lannisters, the coloring of these swords. It's something that there's a lot of rabbit holes you could find out there in the fandom that are fun to dig into. One of my favorites is how well this follows Jon's chapter. It ends abruptly with talk of the Horn of Jormungand, which is said to be capable of splitting the wall. And Jon even thinks of the wall as like a sword to the west or to the east and a snake to the west. One becoming two, a wall of ice being split, a sword, a snake. Yeah. And if we consider that what we saw on TV wasn't the horn taking down the wall, it was a dragon splitting the wall. So maybe that's what happens in the show. Maybe the horn is what controls the dragon. There's different ways for this to work out where it could all happen, and I'm sure you can see these possibilities. Whether you agree with them or not, it's hard to say they're impossible. So you can see a lot of similar themes. There's a wall of ice split by fire in two, a sword and a snake. It's really neat. You can see all these themes kind of dancing together and fitting really well. Pardon me. So not only do we have all that tantalizing sword and steel lore, we get some associated with the Lannister side of things, which is the associated with Tywin's wanting one for the Lannisters comes the notion of that they did have one once. It was wielded last by King Tommen II.
Wait, they did have one? When did they have one?
They had one. Yeah. He was 1-1. The giant was used to be a lion of the Rock. Yeah. He moved north because they didn't like him. So King Tommen II had Bright Roar. Nina points out that Tyrion estimates about 200 Valyrian steel swords in the Seven Kingdoms, which is backed up by the World of Ice and Fire. Again, World of Ice and Fire comes through with some more nuance and some more detail. Archmaester Thurgood says 227 in his book inventories. And that includes a few that have disappeared. So there's some good discussions on our social media about some of these specific swords. Be a little much for us to get into here, but a couple of cool points. Whether or not Thurgood is including non-swords like the dagger, probably not. The cat's paw dagger, that is. But Kago, Corpse Killer's Valyrian Steel Arak, which we see in the Dance with Dragons. Is that one included? Or what about House Celtigar's axe? Or in Fire and Blood, we see Sandok the Shadow with a kind of a curved, maybe like a falchion or Valyrian steel kind of thing. So we're not sure if those are included or not. They might be. They very well might be. Nina also points out that that Jaerion Lannister left to go search for Brightroar the year Tommen was born. So it's the same year Tommen got his name is the same year Jaerion went off in search of King Tommen's lost sword. That's a cool little tidbit I had missed, a little detail, a little connection, little George being sneaky there. Jaerion also, this is something we talked about in our War of Ninepenny Kings 2 live stream that was recent. We had that with Stephen Atwell. We talked about how Tywin has 3 brothers. So there's 4 Lannister men of his generation. Tywin, followed by Kevin, followed by Tyget, followed by Jaerion. In the War of Ninepenny Kings, which is part of why Tywin got, a harder man, even more ruthless than he already was. He got real battle experience in a very nasty, dirty war. He was accompanied by Kevin and Tyget, but not Jaerion. So one theory I proposed at the time is that maybe Jaerion was trying to, do something big to be more like his brothers he was left out of this important formative shared experience. Now, speaking of Tywin's family, moving on to his kids instead of his brothers, Olenna rejects the Cersei marriage, which is interesting, and we hear kind of how the way that plays out. Mace Tyrell seems interested, but then the next day he's like, nah, and Tywin says that was almost certainly Olenna, and us readers are like, yeah, story checks out, probably was Olenna, and you can kind of see why. Cersei is vicious, and, the Tyrells have plans to maybe push the Lannisters aside a bit. Not entirely clear, but whatever Olenna's actual reasoning was, you don't have to think too hard about it. It could just be as simple as, oh, no, we don't want any marriage alliance of Lannister to Tyrell where the Lannister half can dominate the Tyrell half. And Willis is kind of sweet and mild. So maybe she's just picturing Willis being dominated by Cersei, and you don't want the Lord of Highgarden being dominated by a Lannister. So she's like, nah. On the other hand, marrying Marjorie to Tommen, they're all about that because Marjorie can dominate Tommen. And Cersei perceives that, which is why she tries to get in the way. So a lot of the same themes are in play here. It's power games. Tywin is like, yeah, Cersei, Willis, and Olenna's like, no. One marriage to y'all is enough, the one we can control. All right, a couple takes from Joe. A little more about Kevin here. He wants us to read the quote here, or cited the quote, so let's do that. With one son dead and 2 more in mortal danger, Sir Kevin was consumed by grief and fear. Lord Tywin had always relied on his brother, but now he had no choice but to turn again to his dwarf son. Joe points out the ripples of Rickard Karstarks keep on going. We've already discussed his decisions rifling through the Riverlands in Arya's chapter, but now they've reached all the way to the capital, as Kevin is removed from the board with grief for a little while, and that makes Tyrion and Tywin work more closely. Interestingly, though, again, I see nothing about Tywin here. No indication that Tywin's doing something nice for his brother. It's like, you do so much for me, brother, so take a break. That's all. It's like, here, just take a break. You lost some children. Take a break. That's all? I mean, maybe there's more behind the scenes. Tywin can keep things private, but you would think that he deserves something here. Some more consideration than just some time off. Anyway, with the food price, Joe also has a take on the food prices. Either the Tyrells are more about the propaganda side of the food bringing, like they want to be recognized for bringing food, but they're not really bringing that much, or or merchants and sellers are gouging. There might be some of that going on, some price gouging, some doing what they can to get the most money out of people because there's desperate. This could also be an impact of the lack of markets, things being a lot of the seaside market being burned, the fewer places to sell goods in the city. The ones who rule those spots might be trying to jack up their prices because their competitors aren't getting their goods in front of people. Lots of different economic things happening there. Very interesting. George doesn't leave that to be random. He wants that to be part of the story. The realism of a city in aftermath takes a lot of different facets and things into play here. Another little factor in this chapter that's kind of interesting, but maybe a little forgettable, is Tyrion being a little whiny about his arrangement with Sansa. We've talked about the Sansa part, but he complains to his father about Sansa's bedmaids and is like, "Oh, I know they all work for Cersei." This is oddly weak on Tyrion's part. Tywin's like, "Well, you're the husband. Do you know how Westeros works? You're in charge. You can fire them. Just fire them. It's that simple."
It's so funny.
Yeah, I was like, Tyrion, don't you know that, don't you? But he's like, doesn't want to fire her maids, maybe because she thinks she likes her maids and doesn't want to send her friends. I don't know what's in his head here.
It's like if he hires new maids, then who knows who they work for? At least these ones he knows they work for Cersei. But I don't think. Yeah, Tyrion just wasn't thinking about the power he had, I guess.
Yeah. So it's one thing where he's like, Tywin's like perplexed. He's like, dude, you're like a lord. You can fire serving.
If Tyrion wants to be nice to Sansa, he could be like, Sansa, let's pick your handmaids, your bedmaids together. You can meet them.
Yeah, give her the agency. Like, that's a great example of something that's kind of obvious. But Tyrion is
on camera.
Yeah, Xerxes. But Tyrion is just so not in the right place with his head. Like, it's just let her decide.
Did you say Tyrion or Xerxes?
Yeah. Both. So Joe also wonders about this fact about how she may have spilled secrets to she definitely spilled secrets to Dantos and then doesn't realize it. It's entirely possible the same thing is happening here. She may have spilled some secrets to her bedmaids or her servants or handmaids, whatever you want to call them, and that's Tyrion's worrying about that. And he might have good reason because Sansa hasn't quite learned the flow of information yet. Okay. We're about to be wrapping it all up here. A couple more takes. Joe also points to the rudeness of Tywin, not moving away from his perhaps lack of sympathy for his brother. When the sword comes out, when Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper are sitting there, he's like, "It is meant for my son." Joe says, would it really have hurt to say it is meant for Jaime? Could have, because Tyrion's like, in his head, he's like, "Oh, I know what son he's talking about, you jerk." He could have just said it's for Jaime, and that wouldn't, it's just a good example of Tywin probably not intentionally saying it that way to get Tyrion. It's just how he just doesn't think of these things. He's just casually insulting and cruel without realizing it. It's a constant stream from Tywin. He just doesn't operate that way. And then he says things like, "If you have need of a dagger, take one from the armory." The only, and then there, Tywin says, "The only blade Robert ever used was the hunting knife he had from John Arryn when he was a boy." And then the line says, "Lord Tywin waved a hand, dismissing King Robert and all his knives." Interesting, because that's the cat's paw dagger and all that. That plot line hasn't really been resolved, so maybe it shouldn't be dismissed. Joe is wondering if that's George playing with that a little bit, saying it's never actually going to fully get resolved. The show gave us some resolution to that, but I'm a little skeptical it's going to go that way. Even if some of the high points are still hit, like the whole Littlefinger dying part, that I believe, but being executed with the cat's paw dagger, a little iffy on that. And so with the money argument, it's funny how Tywin is pushing for all these things to happen, but he also at the same time won't spend any of his own money, won't forgive any debts, but at the same time is like, "Oh, we got to show off our extravagance. Extravagance has its uses, and you don't want to look poor when we're trying to show how capable we are of ruling the realm." Again, Tywin very focused on the optics of things. If he could look like he spent a lot of money without doing it, he'd probably be fine with that. But
I think I remember, if you do, Lady X Triple from Blood of the Podcast.
Yeah.
Christina, she said her family motto was, "You never want to look cheap" or something. Nothing's worse
yeah,
than
that's their
looking
sigil.
cheap.
You never want to look cheap. Being cheap is fine. Looking cheap.
Yes,
That's
same thing right here. True
Yes.
Lannisters.
Very good point. Yes, that is very apt here. A couple other takes from Nina, and then some takes from y'all. Tyrion mentions that it's an open secret that his marriage is to Sansa is unconsummated, which I think will be important in the Winds of Winter, because Littlefinger is going to gather the religious authorities of the Vale and have them declare that Sansa and Tyrion's marriage is a legal nullity because it was never consumed, meaning it just doesn't count. And that is really important that George is laying that groundwork, because if he doesn't, then it might not work, because how will it be provable that they didn't sleep together?
It's he said, she said, and they're more likely to believe the he said, unless Sansa's just so well loved and Littlefinger's bribed people and all of that. But
So they're going to have to bribe people to say what's true. It's
yeah, there's no proving it, and it depends on what Sansa says. And as of now,
so this
seems
hearsay,
like she'd say yes.
Yeah, you're right. And this hearsay here will maybe help. Like this could be witnesses, could be people. And the talk of King's Landing at the time was the same thing, so that could be cited. So that's George thinking ahead pretty well here with the plotting of that arc. Now back to Simon Silvertongue for a second here. Tyrion's dealing with him is very Tywin-esque, of course, and Tyrion specifically thinks how his father would have done similarly. But one difference, of course, is that the whole business with Shae would have been handled differently. That's why Tyrion can't be like, "Hey, father, you'd be proud of this, because you know that girl you said I couldn't bring to King's Landing? Well, actually, forget that for a minute, but you'll be proud of how I handled it." Another lead into Tywin's influence on his kids is the shared sarcasm that comes up here. They actually share a joke about the knives. When Tywin says, like, yeah, people are always trying to give Robert knives and stuff, and Tyrion's like, they should have given, they would have gotten more result if they gave him their daughters. And Tywin's like, yeah, no doubt. It's not a joke. Tywin's not laughing with him, but Tywin is sarcastic. Right? And to me, this is interesting because all the Lannister kids are sarcastic, and it's sort of like the thing that clues you in if you've been missing it. It's like, look at how this more obvious thing has been passed down from father to children. They all have that sarcasm. Well, what else do they have in common? And I've thought that was appropriate to point out in this chapter, because there's a lot of Tyrion being like Tywin and other people being like Tywin, say John Connington in the previous chapter. So understanding where that all emanates from, besides just generic, like father, like son. It's not quite that simple. It's easy to just to say it that way, but there's more nuance to it. Tree Girl points out yet another sign that Tyrion is not great, which is that he's not even kind to Podrick. I mean, come on. You're making fun of him because he's always stumbling with his speech and all that, and he's always looking at his feet, and you're sure he can be a little irritating to work with. But come on, man, that kid saved your life. Like, full stop.
It's kind of interesting.
You owe him your life.
Is that I completely agree with you, but I feel like Tyrion would have a special lack of respect for someone who's not well-spoken.
Yeah, it's true. I mean,
it's so important to him.
I think that explains it, but that doesn't necessarily justify it.
No, it doesn't justify it,
right?
exactly. But in thinking about why Tyrion feels that way, he's like, you're not even well-spoken. You have all this privilege over me, in that you could be a fighter.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You aren't even that. You're clumsy. I mean,
very good point.
I can kind of see it. I mean, again, I cannot possibly justify it, but
well, that's a good. I mean, you're right. And that's the conundrum we've been getting with Tyrion. We keep hearing ourselves say that, like, well, he does it because of this. Not that we're saying it's okay. Like,
yeah, we're just looking at his motivations behind why he does it, and that's a subconscious one for sure.
You're
like
totally
Tyrion
right.
Would ever think about that?
It's another testament to George of how much detail he puts into these. Even the things, even Tyrion's hatefulness is rooted in something that quote unquote makes sense given who he is and how he views the world and how he views Podrick and all that. So yeah, that's a great catch, great take. Speaking of stumbling on speech, this chapter left a lot of people a bit speechless. A lot of takes from our social media outlets were a little muted. People were focused on a lot of the details, and I think this is in part because what we talked about at the beginning, seeing Tyrion in this different light, this thinking about him differently. And it doesn't mean thinking he's a bad person now. It just means thinking, oh, there's a lot of bad there. Maybe he can get out of that. Maybe he can come back and be a decent person. But let's not call a funny guy a good person because he's funny. Let's call him out for the things that he deserves to be called out for. He called common people rats for just wanting to survive. He doesn't treat Shay terribly well. He doesn't understand. He doesn't treat Sansa badly, but he hasn't put that much effort into trying to understand her.
Yeah, he hasn't done any basic kindnesses for her.
Yeah, his version of kindness is to just like kind of leave her alone and say,
Yeah.
And you can kind of understand that too. That's tragic too,
Yeah.
because he thinks he's just wrapped up in his own head about how he's disgusting to her, and he's like, well, maybe the best thing I can do is just
Just
get
out
out
of
of her
sight,
way.
out of mind. She won't have to think about me.
So you can kind of again, it's sort of traumatic for him to try to figure this all out, but at the same time, he doesn't get points for it either, you know? So, yeah, that's really quite poignant, and we'll be continuing to look for more signs of what direction Tyrion's going, looking for all the breadcrumbs George left us to see. It's wonderful and tragic at the same time. It's dark, but it's also masterful by George that some of these things that so many of us are looking at these things differently after 20 years or so. Wow. Right? That's so awesome to me. It continues to show how fun this project is to reread the books, take a second look, reconsider a lot of things. All right. Last week we covered 182 minutes and 15 seconds of the audiobook. This week it was 143 minutes 42 seconds, which is almost exactly the same length as 2 weeks before. But 2 weeks before it was only 4 chapters. But that's, of course, a function of these chapters being on the shorter end. Like I said, Tyrion's was the only one of above average length. We have covered 1,116 minutes, 46 seconds of 2,853 minutes, 37 seconds of A Storm of Swords. Trucking along, folks. You can always check the video length to see how much was cut for the podcast.
Right now, it is 2 hours and 27 minutes.
Right on. Next time, 5 chapters as per the normal. It'll begin with Samwell 2, The Gang Gets Mutinous, a.k.a. the one where Sam and Gilly run off.
Arya 6, Under the Hollow Hill, a.k.a. the Hound versus the Lightning Lord.
Catelyn 4, the one with Hoster's funeral boat, a.k.a. the phrase, bait a floppy fish.
Davos 4, the Great Claw Isle Debate, a.k.a. the one where Davos is promoted.
And Jaime 5, Beauty in the Bath, a.k.a. My Dinner with Bolton. Thanks again to Ashea, who is the best. Thanks to Joe Buckley. Thanks to Nina Friel. Thanks to our excellent History of Westeros mods who post every chapter with art and discussion points to help bring out some of the best in these chapters that help me catch things that I missed and reconsider things that I didn't. Flick, Facebook, Slack, and Discord, again, are wonderful places to join the discussion, submit your thoughts, or just lurk and read what other people are saying if that's the way you prefer to do it. Thanks also to Michael Klarfeld for his wonderful map work, his work with our video intro, and thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the Valar Rereadis music. Thanks to Jesse Kowal and Joey Townsend and Jesse Kowal for our intro-outro music for our regular podcasting. Thank you to our Bengineer for doing a lot of the sound work and making the podcast sound better and well recorded. And of course, last but not least, thank you very much to all the wonderful patrons, member Westorians who support us financially, and everyone who likes and shares and subscribes and comments and tells their friends. You'd be surprised how much that helps. It really does make a big difference. And we'll see you all next week. Schedule remains unchanged for the time being. We've got a nice long stretch of chapters before our next. We've got one break coming up on the 15th of March.
I'll be in New York City.
Yay.
I'm going to post in the Facebook group to see about organizing something where people want to hang out. So keep an eye out for that.
Yay! And until next time, where we have more plans, more chapters, and more fun, Valar Rereadis.